you stumbled into Dreadful Lullaby, a place where bedtime stories take a darker turn. I'm curious, what time are you listening, and where are you watching from? Tell me below so I know where my little lullabies are reaching tonight.
Story 1. The Lumber Survey. This happened 2 years ago when I was 31, working as a timber surveyor for Great Lakes Forestry Company in Michigan's Manistee National Forest. I'd been doing forestry work for about 8 years, but this was my first solo assignment in what the locals called the deep woods. Sections of old growth forest that had somehow escaped the logging boom of the 1800s. My job was to assess timber quality and mark trees for selective harvesting in a 2,000-acre tract about 15 miles northeast of Baldwin. The area was accessed by old logging roads that were barely more than dirt tracks winding through dense stands of oak, maple, and pine. I'd been working the survey for 3 days, staying in a small travel trailer parked at a Forest Service clearing. The work was routine, but required careful attention, measuring tree diameter, assessing health, and marking specific specimens with spray paint for the harvest crews who'd follow later. The forest was beautiful in that late September way, with leaves just starting to turn and the morning air crisp enough to make you appreciate hot coffee from a thermos. I was enjoying the solitude after months of working with noisy crews in more developed areas. On my 4th morning, I found my first indication that something was taking an interest in my work. Several of the trees I'd marked the previous day had been examined. The spray paint marks were intact, but the bark around them showed deep scratches, as if something with very large claws had been testing the marked areas. The scratches were too high to be from bears, at least 8 feet off the ground, and showed a deliberate pattern that suggested intelligence rather than random animal behavior. Whatever had made them understood that my paint marks indicated something significant about those particular trees. I mentioned the scratches to Jim Walsh, the Forest Service ranger who checked on my progress, but he just shrugged. "Probably black bears marking territory," he said. "They'll claw trees to leave scent markers. Nothing to worry about as long as you secure your food properly." But I'd seen bear claw marks before, and these were different, deeper, more precise, and accompanied by what looked like handprints pressed into the softer bark. The prints showed fingers that were too long and ended in claws, but they also had opposable thumbs. That evening, while I was updating my survey notes in the trailer, I started hearing sounds from the forest that didn't match normal woodland activity. Heavy footsteps circling my campsite, but with an irregular rhythm that suggested something switching between walking on 2 legs and 4. I looked out the trailer windows, but couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond my propane lanterns. The footsteps continued for about an hour, sometimes approaching close enough that I could hear breathing. Deep, controlled inhalations that sounded too large for any animal I knew in Michigan forests. Around 10 p.m., I heard something that made me reconsider what I might be dealing with. A howl that started low and animal-like, but rose to something that sounded almost human, like someone screaming in terrible pain or fear. The sound echoed through the trees and seemed to come from multiple directions. I'd heard wolves howling before, and this wasn't the same thing. There was something in that sound that triggered a fear response deeper than anything I'd experienced, even during my time in the military. It was a sound that made every instinct tell me to run. The howling stopped, but it was replaced by something worse. Complete silence. No insects, no night birds, no wind through the leaves. Just absolute quiet that felt oppressive and wrong. I stayed inside the trailer with the doors locked and tried to focus on my paperwork, but I kept checking the windows. Around midnight, I saw eyes reflecting my lantern light from the tree line. Yellow amber eyes that were too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest animal. The eyes stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, just watching. They didn't move like an animal's eyes would, constantly scanning for threats or food. They stayed focused on my trailer with the kind of steady attention that suggested intelligence and purpose. When I woke up the next morning, I found tracks around my campsite that confirmed my suspicions about being observed. The footprints were enormous, easily 12 inches long, and showed something that had been walking upright on two legs most of the time, but occasionally dropping to all fours. The stride length indicated something over 7 feet tall, and the depth of the impressions suggested weight that was much heavier than a normal person. But the most disturbing aspect was the intelligence the tracking showed. The creature had approached from downwind, used natural cover to stay concealed, and positioned itself for optimal observation of my activities. That day, while I was working about a mile from camp, I had my first clear sighting of what had been stalking me. I was measuring a large oak when I heard branches breaking behind me. I turned and saw something that made me question everything I thought I knew about Michigan wildlife. It was standing about 50 yards away, partially concealed behind a cluster of pine trees, 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with a muscular human-like torso covered in dark brown fur. But the head was wrong, elongated like a wolf's, with pointed ears and a muzzle full of teeth that I could see even from that distance. What terrified me most were the eyes. They glowed with their own amber light and looked at me with intelligence that was definitely not animal. There was recognition there, and something that might have been curiosity, but also a predatory patience that made my blood run cold. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it did something that violated every law of natural movements I understood. It dropped from upright to all fours in a single fluid motion, and disappeared into the underbrush with speed that seemed impossible for something that size. I heard it moving through the forest, circling my position, and I realized I was being hunted by something that combined human intelligence with predatory capabilities that exceeded any known wildlife. I packed my equipment and hiked back to the trailer as quickly as possible, constantly checking over my shoulder. That evening, I called my supervisor and reported that I was experiencing equipment problems that would require me to return to the office for additional gear. When I drove out the next morning, I could see the creature watching from the forest edge. It stood upright among the trees, making no attempt to hide, and followed my trailer with those terrible amber eyes until I reached the main road. I completed my forestry degree and transferred to urban tree management with the City Parks Department. When other surveyors ask about remote forest work, I tell them about equipment challenges and difficult access roads. Some experiences are too far outside normal reality to discuss in professional contexts, but I still have dreams about those amber eyes and the intelligence I saw there. Not animal intelligence, but something else that understood exactly what I was and saw me as something that didn't belong in its territory. Story 2. The Bray Road Dispatcher. Working as a 911 dispatcher in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, you learn to handle calls about everything from domestic disputes to medical emergencies. But during my 7 years with Walworth County Emergency Services, I took one call that still makes me question what's really prowling the back roads around Bray Road when the sun goes down. This happened 18 months ago when I was 29, during a shift that started routine and ended with me filing the strangest incident report of my career. It was a Tuesday night in early November, about 11:30 p.m, when the call came in. The caller ID showed a cell phone number, and when I answered, I could immediately tell something was wrong. Heavy breathing, background noise of an idling car engine, and that particular quality of fear that you learn to recognize after handling emergency calls for years. 911, what's your emergency? I said, following standard protocol. Jesus Christ, I need help, came the response. Male voice, mid-30s, trying to keep control but clearly shaken. There's something on Bray Road, something that's not... It's not human. It's looking at me right now. I'd handled probably a dozen Beast of Bray Road calls over the years. Usually teenagers trying to prank the system, or adults who'd had too much to drink and convinced themselves they'd seen something unusual. But this caller sounded different, genuinely terrified, not performing for attention. "What's your name, sir?" I asked, pulling up the GPS location from his cell phone. The coordinates showed him on Bray Road, about 2 miles south of Elkhorn, right in the heart of what locals call sighting territory. "Mark Patterson. I'm an insurance adjuster from Milwaukee. I was driving back from a claim in Lake Geneva when... Christ, it's still there. It's standing next to my car." I could hear his breathing getting more rapid, the edge of panic creeping into his voice. Through his phone, I caught what sounded like scratching. Metal on metal, like something with claws testing his vehicle. "Mark, I need you to stay calm. Can you describe what you're seeing?" It's like a wolf, but it's standing on 2 legs, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, but the body is wrong, too muscular, like a bodybuilder. And the head..." He paused, and I heard what sounded like a low growling in the background. The head is definitely a dog or wolf, but with teeth that are too big. And the eyes... God, the eyes are glowing yellow. I was typing notes as he spoke, following our protocol for unusual incident reports. The description matched dozens of previous Bray Road encounters dating back to the 1980s, but Mark's terror seemed genuine. "Mark, are you inside your vehicle with the doors locked?" "Yes, but it's looking through the window at me. It's tilting its head like it's trying to understand what I am. This isn't normal animal behavior. There's intelligence in those eyes." As he spoke, I could hear the scratching sounds getting more pronounced through his phone. Then Mark made a sound that raised every hair on my neck, a gasp of pure terror. "Oh God, it's using its hands. It has hands, not paws. It's testing my door handle." I immediately dispatched Sheriff's Deputy Tom Rodriguez, who was patrolling about 10 minutes from Mark's location. "Unit 23, I have a possible animal encounter on Bray Road, requesting immediate response. Copy that dispatch. Is this another Dogman call?" Tom's voice carried the weary familiarity of someone who'd responded to similar reports. "Affirmative, but the caller seems genuinely distressed. Approach with caution." Through the phone, I could hear Mark's breathing becoming more labored. "It's moving around the car now. It's walking upright, but the legs are wrong. They bend backward like a dog's legs, and it's huge. If it wanted to break my windows." "Mark, help is on the way. Stay in your vehicle and keep talking to me." For the next few minutes, Mark provided a running commentary that was unlike any previous Bray Road call I'd handled. Most reports were brief sightings, something glimpsed in headlights that disappeared quickly. But this creature seemed in no hurry to leave. It was systematically examining Mark's car, apparently curious about the vehicle and its occupant. "It's smelling the air around my car," Mark reported, "and making sounds, not growling exactly, but like it's talking to itself. low rumbling noises that almost sound like words. Then Mark went silent, except for rapid breathing. "Mark, are you there?" "He's looking directly at me through the windshield," he whispered, and I swear is trying to communicate. It's making gestures with its hands, pointing at me, then at the forest, like it wants me to get out of the car. "Don't even consider it. Stay exactly where you are." The eyes. There's intelligence there, but not human intelligence. It knows I'm afraid, and it seems to find that interesting rather than threatening. I could hear Tom's patrol car approaching in the background. The distinctive sound of a Crown Victoria with emergency lights, but no siren. Through Mark's phone, I heard what sounded like a reaction from the creature. "It heard the police car," Mark reported. "It's looking toward the road and..." Jesus, it just turned back to me and made a sound like laughing. Not human laughter, but like it finds something amusing. Unit 23. Do you have visual on the caller's vehicle? I radioed Tom. Affirmative. Blue Honda Accord, Ohio plates, engine running, headlights on. I can see someone in the driver's seat, but, dispatch, there's nothing else here. No animal, no tracks in the ditch grass, nothing. Through the phone, I heard Mark's confusion. Where did it go? It was right here. And then, it just vanished. 1 second, it was looking at me through the windshield. The next second, there was nothing. Tom approached Mark's vehicle and confirmed that he was unharmed, but clearly shaken. A thorough search of the area with flashlights revealed no tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence that anything large had been in the vicinity. But Tom did find something that he included in his report. Deep scratches in the paint on Mark's passenger door, consistent with claws much larger than any known Wisconsin wildlife. The scratches formed a pattern that looked almost like a handprint. Mark's insurance company later classified the damage as vandalism, but Mark insisted no human could have made marks that deep or reached that high on his vehicle. He returned to Milwaukee the next day and never drove through Walworth County again. I stayed in contact with Mark for several weeks after the incident. He was a stable, professional man with no history of mental illness or substance abuse. His description of the encounter remained consistent in follow-up interviews, and he had no interest in publicity or social media attention. What bothered me most about the call wasn't just Mark's terror, but his description of intelligence and curiosity in the creature's behavior. Most animal encounters involve fear responses, fight, flight, or defensive posturing. But Mark described something that seemed to be studying him, trying to understand what he was and perhaps attempting some form of communication. I continued working as a dispatcher for another year, but I requested transfer to day shifts and avoided assignments that might involve Bray Road calls. When new dispatchers ask about handling unusual incident reports, I tell them to focus on the caller's immediate safety and let the officers worry about what they might or might not find at the scene. But I still think about that November night and wonder what was really examining Mark's car with such intelligent curiosity. And sometimes, during quiet night shifts, I find myself hoping that particular phone never rings again. Story 3. The Trail Camera Operator. Setting up trail cameras throughout Michigan's wilderness for the Department of Natural Resources taught me that some animals don't behave the way they're supposed to when they think nobody's watching. This became abundantly clear during the fall I spent monitoring wildlife populations in the Manistee National Forest, when I was 34 and working as a field biologist documenting deer, bear, and other large mammal activity in areas where hunting pressure might be affecting normal behavior patterns. The job involved placing motion-activated cameras at strategic locations, game trails, water sources, feeding areas, and returning monthly to download footage and change batteries. I'd been running camera surveys for about 6 years and thought I'd seen every type of wildlife behavior that Michigan forests had to offer. The cameras I'm talking about were installed along the Manistee River system, in an area about 20 miles northeast of Cadillac that had a reputation among local hunters for unusual animal activity. Nothing specific, just stories about game animals acting spooked and hunters hearing sounds that didn't match known wildlife. I'd placed 12 cameras throughout a 10-square-mile area, focusing on locations where deer trails cross creek beds and areas where bears might be foraging for late-season food sources. The equipment was standard wildlife monitoring gear, infrared triggers, HD video capability, and weatherproof housings designed to operate for months without maintenance. For the first 2 months, the cameras captured exactly what I expected: white-tailed deer, black bears, wild turkeys, and the occasional coyote moving through their territories in predictable patterns. The footage was useful for population estimates and behavior studies, but nothing unusual. That changed in October, when I retrieved footage that included sequences I couldn't explain using standard wildlife biology. Camera 7, positioned near a creek crossing about 5 miles from the nearest road, had captured something that made me review the footage multiple times before accepting what I was seeing. The timestamp showed 2:30 a.m. on October 15th, when most large mammals should have been following normal nocturnal activity patterns. The sequence began with typical deer footage: a small group of does approaching the creek for water, alert but relaxed behavior, normal interaction with their environment. Then something happened that caused all 4 deer to freeze simultaneously in obvious terror. They didn't just look alert or cautious. These animals were paralyzed with fear, standing motionless with their ears pinned back, and every muscle tensed for flight. For nearly 30 seconds, they remained frozen while something outside the camera's field of view moved through the forest. Then they bolted. Not the normal bounding flight of startled deer, but desperate panic that sent them crashing through brush regardless of noise or injury. In 12 years of wildlife observation, I'd never seen deer react with such extreme terror to anything. But the most disturbing footage came next. About 10 minutes after the deer fled, something else approached the creek. At first, I thought it might be a black bear moving through the area, which would explain the deer's reaction. But what appeared on camera was unlike any bear in my experience. The creature was enormous, easily 7 feet tall when it rose to full height. But the body proportions were all wrong for a bear. Too narrow through the torso, too long in the limbs, and when it moved, it switched fluidly between walking on 4 legs and standing upright on 2. But it was the head that convinced me I wasn't looking at any known Michigan wildlife. Elongated and canine, with pointed ears and what appeared to be a muzzle full of prominent teeth. When it looked directly at the camera, I could see eyes that reflected the infrared flash with an amber glow. The creature approached the camera with obvious curiosity, tilting its head and studying the device like it understood what it was. It reached out with what were clearly hands, not paws, and touched the camera housing with careful deliberation. For nearly 5 minutes, it examined the camera from different angles, sometimes standing upright to get a better view, sometimes dropping to all fours to investigate the base and mounting system. The level of intelligence displayed was remarkable, suggesting problem-solving abilities that exceeded anything I'd documented in Michigan wildlife. But the most unsettling aspect of the footage was what happened next. The creature looked directly into the camera lens and made a vocalization that the audio system recorded clearly. It wasn't a growl, howl, or any sound I could identify from known animals. It was almost like speech, low, rumbling vocalizations that had the rhythm and inflection of language. Then it did something that made me question the boundary between animal and human intelligence. It raised one hand and waved at the camera, not a random gesture, but a deliberate acknowledgement that it understood it was being recorded. I spent the next week reviewing footage from all 12 cameras, looking for additional evidence of unusual activity. What I found was a pattern of encounters that suggested systematic investigation of my camera network by something with planning capability and apparent understanding of surveillance technology. Camera 3 captured the creature examining the device and then deliberately moving outside the trigger zone while still remaining visible at the edge of the frame. Behavior that demonstrated understanding of how motion detection systems work. Camera 9 recorded the creature approaching from directly behind, suggesting it had studied the camera's field of view and identified the blind spot that would allow undetected approach. Most disturbing was footage from camera 11, where the creature appeared to have learned from its previous encounters with my equipment. It approached with deliberate stealth, avoided triggering the motion sensor, and spent nearly 20 minutes in the area without appearing on camera. I only knew it had been there because of the clear handprints it left on the device housing. When I reported my findings to the DNR regional office, I focused on documenting unusual wildlife behavior rather than making specific claims about unknown species. But the senior biologist who reviewed my footage, Dr. Sarah Chen, had worked in Michigan forests for over 20 years and recognized implications that went beyond standard wildlife monitoring. I've seen similar footage from other remote camera installations, she told me privately. Nothing that we've been able to explain using conventional wildlife biology, and nothing that we discuss in official reports. Dr. Chen arranged for my footage to be reviewed by specialists at Michigan State University who had experience with unusual animal behavior. Their conclusion was that the recordings showed either an unknown species or a known species displaying behavioral complexity that challenged current understanding of wildlife intelligence. But the academic review also raised questions about public safety and the potential implications of documenting creatures that demonstrated such advanced problem-solving abilities and apparent awareness of human monitoring activities. I continued working wildlife surveys for the DNR for another season, but I requested assignment to areas closer to populated regions and avoided camera installations in the most remote sections of the Manistee National Forest. The footage I captured was archived in the DNR database with restricted access, officially classified as unusual wildlife behavior requiring further study. But those of us who worked the remote forest areas understood that some animals in Michigan's wilderness didn't fit standard classification systems. When other field biologists ask about camera placement in extremely remote areas, I recommend focusing on locations that have regular human activity and avoiding areas where local hunters report spooked game animals. Some wildlife observation is better conducted from a distance, with backup, and with the understanding that you might document things that challenge basic assumptions about what lives in Michigan's forests. Story 4. The power line maintenance. Maintaining electrical transmission lines through the remote areas of northern Wisconsin requires working in forests where you might not see another person for days. During the 8 years I'd been doing this job for Wisconsin Electric Power Company, I thought I understood what kinds of wildlife I might encounter while servicing towers and clearing vegetation. That changed during a routine maintenance job in Walworth County, about 15 miles from the town of Elkhorn, when I was 36 and discovered that some creatures take a very personal interest in human activities in their territory. The job was standard transmission line maintenance, a section of 138 kV line that ran through dense forest between substations. Several towers needed vegetation clearing, and there were reports of wildlife damage to equipment that required inspection and repair. I was working alone, which was normal for routine maintenance in remote areas. My truck was equipped with a hydraulic bucket lift, chainsaws, and all the safety equipment required for working around high voltage lines. The work area was accessible by forest roads, but I was far enough from civilization that cell phone service was spotty at best. The transmission line corridor cut a 100-foot wide swath through oak and maple forest, creating an artificial clearing that attracted wildlife and provided easy travel routes for animals moving between different habitat areas. I'd worked similar jobs throughout Wisconsin and was familiar with the challenge of keeping deer, bears, and birds away from electrical equipment. For the first 2 days, the work went exactly as expected. I cleared vegetation from around tower bases, repaired minor equipment damage, and documented the condition of insulators and hardware. The forest was beautiful in early October, with leaves just starting to change and wildlife actively preparing for winter. On my third morning, I found evidence that something had been investigating my work area during the night. My truck showed scratches. On the driver's side door, deep gouges in the paint that looked like claw marks from something with very large paws and considerable strength. The scratches were too high and too deep to be from any common Wisconsin wildlife. Black bears were possible in the area, but these marks were at least 8 feet off the ground and showed a pattern that suggested deliberate examination rather than random scratching. Around the base of the transmission tower where I'd been working, I found footprints that made me reconsider what kinds of animals might be sharing this forest. The tracks were enormous, at least 12 inches long, and showed something that had been walking upright on 2 legs. The prints were accompanied by what appeared to be handprints pressed into softer ground, showing fingers that were too long and ended in claws, but clearly had opposable thumbs and demonstrated manual dexterity. I called my supervisor, Joe Martinez, to report possible bear activity in the work area. Joe had 20 years of experience with transmission line maintenance and had dealt with wildlife issues throughout Wisconsin. "Probably a black bear checking out your truck," he said. "They're curious animals, and they'll investigate anything new in their territory. Just make sure you're securing all food and scented items in your truck cab." But when I described the height and pattern of the scratches, Joe was less certain about his bear theory. "That's higher than a bear could reach, even standing on his hind legs," he admitted. "And the claw pattern sounds unusual. Maybe it's time to consider a different work schedule or partner assignment for that location." That evening, while I was updating my maintenance reports, I heard sounds from the forest that didn't match normal woodland activity. Heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush, but with an irregular rhythm that suggested something switching between 2 legs and 4 legs as it moved. I looked out the windows of my truck, but all I could see were my work lights, creating a small circle of visibility in the darkness. The footsteps continued for over an hour, sometimes approaching close to the transmission line corridor, sometimes receding deeper into the forest. Around 10 p.m., I heard something that made me question my understanding of Wisconsin wildlife. a vocalization that started as a low growl, but rose to what sounded almost like human speech. Deep, rumbling sounds that had the rhythm and inflection of language, but weren't recognizable as any known animal communication. The sounds seemed to come from multiple locations around my work area, suggesting either multiple animals or one creature that was moving with remarkable speed and stealth through dense forest. I spent the night in my truck with the doors locked and the engine running, ready to leave quickly if whatever was out there decided to approach more directly. But the sounds gradually faded around midnight, leaving only normal forest noises. The next morning brought my first clear sighting of what had been stalking my work area. I was in the bucket lift, about 40 feet above ground, working on insulator replacement when I saw movement at the forest edge. A creature emerged from the tree line and stood watching my work with obvious interest. It was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, with a muscular human-like torso covered in dark brown fur. But the head was unmistakably canine, with pointed ears and a muzzle that showed prominent teeth even from that distance. What struck me most were the eyes. They glowed with their own amber light and tracked my movements with intelligence that was definitely not animal. There was recognition there, curiosity, and something that might have been evaluation, like it was studying my work methods and trying to understand what I was doing to its territory. We observed each other for several minutes. The creature made no aggressive movements, but it also showed no fear of my equipment or presence. It seemed perfectly comfortable standing in the open, confident in its ability to handle any threat I might represent. Then it did something that violated every assumption I had about wildlife behavior. It raised one hand, and they were definitely hands, not paws, and made what appeared to be a deliberately threatening gesture. Not random animal posturing, but a clear communication that I was not welcome in this area. I completed my work on that tower as quickly as safety protocols allowed, and moved to the next site in my maintenance schedule. But the creature followed my progress, staying visible at the forest edge and continuing to observe my activities. At the next tower, about a quarter-mile down the transmission line, I found more evidence of intelligent investigation. My equipment had been examined overnight, with clear handprints on my toolboxes and truck tailgate. Nothing was damaged or missing, but everything showed signs of systematic inspection by something trying to understand human technology and work methods. The creature appeared again while I was working, this time approaching closer to the transmission line corridor. It studied my equipment with obvious fascination, particularly the hydraulic bucket lift and electrical testing instruments. But when our eyes met, I saw something that made me decide to abandon the job immediately. The intelligence in those amber eyes wasn't just curious, it was calculating, evaluating me as a potential threat to its territory, and apparently reaching conclusions about how to handle my presence. I packed my equipment and drove out to the forest, reporting equipment problems that would require additional parts and a return visit with backup personnel. When I filed my maintenance report, I focused on the successful completion of critical repairs and mentioned only briefly that wildlife activity in the area might require modified work procedures for future assignments. The transmission line continues to operate normally, but maintenance in that section is now conducted by two-person crews with enhanced communication equipment. The official reason is improved safety protocols, but those of us who work the remote forest areas understand that some wildlife encounters require precautions that go beyond standard safety procedures. I still work transmission line maintenance, but I'm more selective about accepting solo assignments in areas where local people have stories about unusual animal activity. Some encounters with wildlife are better avoided entirely, especially when the intelligence in those eyes suggests you're being evaluated as something more than just another maintenance worker. Story 5. The DNR Warden. Being a conservation officer for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources means dealing with poachers, checking hunting licenses, and investigating wildlife violations in some of the most remote areas of the state. During my 12 years with the DNR, I'd handled everything from illegal bear baiting to off-season deer hunting. But I never encountered anything that challenged my understanding of what actually lives in Michigan's forests until a case that came up 3 years ago in Wexford County, when I was 38, and investigating reports of unusual predation on livestock near the Manistee National Forest. The reports started coming in during late October. Farmers in the area around Mesick reporting cattle and sheep kills that didn't match normal predation patterns. The attacks were too organized for coyotes, too selective for bears, and showed a level of intelligence that suggested something with problem-solving abilities beyond typical Michigan wildlife. My investigation began at the Davidson farm, where 3 sheep had been killed over a 2-week period. Carl Davidson had been raising livestock for over 20 years and knew the difference between coyote kills, dog attacks, and bear predation. "This is something I've never seen before," he told me, leading me to the area where the attacks had occurred. "The kills are clean, almost surgical, and whatever did it took only specific parts, always the organs, never touched the rest of the carcass. The kill sites showed evidence of intelligence that exceeded anything in my experience with wildlife investigations. The predator had approached from downwind, avoided the electric fence that contained the sheep, and selected specific animals that were separated from the main flock. Most disturbing were the tracks around the kill sites. Footprints that were enormous, easily 14 inches long, and showed something that had been walking upright on 2 legs most of the time, but occasionally dropping to all 4s. The depth and clarity of the prints indicated something that weighed at least 300 pounds, but the stride length suggested a height of 7 or 8 feet. The tracks were accompanied by what appeared to be handprints, showing fingers with claws, but also clear evidence of opposable thumbs. I collected plaster casts of the best prints and sent them to the DNR Wildlife Identification Lab in Lansing. The response was immediate and puzzling. The tracks didn't match any known Michigan wildlife, but they showed anatomical features that suggested both human and canine characteristics. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the senior wildlife biologist who examined the casts, called me personally to discuss the findings. These prints show bipedal locomotion with plantigrade foot placement, she told me. That's more consistent with primate species than anything we have in Michigan. But the claw marks and overall size suggest a large carnivore. Dr. Walsh recommended expanding the investigation to include other agencies and consulting with specialists who had experience with unusual wildlife encounters. Over the following week, I investigated 3 more livestock attacks in the same general area. Each showed the same pattern: intelligent approach, selective predation, surgical precision in the kills, and tracks that suggested a predator unlike anything in standard wildlife identification guides. But I also started receiving reports of sightings from residents who were reluctant to provide official statements, but were willing to share their experiences off the record. Margaret Thompson, whose property bordered the Manistee National Forest, described seeing something watching her house from the tree line during evening hours. It was standing upright like a man, but it was too tall and too wide through the shoulders, she told me. When it turned to look at me, I could see the head was like a dog or wolf, but with human-like eyes that seemed to recognize me. Margaret had lived in the area for over 40 years and was familiar with all the local wildlife. Her description of intelligent, evaluative behavior was consistent with other reports I had been receiving. Similar stories came from Jerry Kowalski, a bow hunter who'd been tracking deer in the National Forest when he encountered something that made him abandon his hunting season. I was in my tree stand about an hour before dawn when I heard something big moving through the forest, he told me. But it wasn't moving like any animal I know. It would walk on two legs for a while, then drop down and move on all fours, then stand up again. Jerry described watching the creature for nearly 20 minutes as it systematically investigated his hunting area, apparently following scent trails and studying the terrain with obvious intelligence. When it looked up at my tree stand, I could see eyes that glowed in the pre-dawn light, and I swear it smiled at me, not a friendly smile, but like it was amused that I thought I was hidden. After 3 weeks of investigation, I had documented 14 livestock kills, collected dozens of plaster casts of unusual tracks, and interviewed 8 witnesses who described encounters with something that didn't fit standard wildlife categories. But I also had my own encounter that convinced me the investigation involved more than just unusual predation patterns. I was conducting nighttime surveillance at the Morrison farm, where 2 calves had been killed the previous week, when I saw something that challenged everything I thought I knew about Michigan wildlife. It was about 2 a.m., and I was positioned in my patrol vehicle with night vision equipment, watching the pasture where the kills had occurred. The cattle were restless, bunched together in the center of the field rather than spread out grazing. Then I saw why they were nervous. Something was moving along the fence line, not trying to get in, but studying the layout of the pasture and the position of the animals. Through the night vision scope, I could see it clearly. 7 feet tall, maybe more, with a muscular torso covered in dark fur. But the head was unmistakably canine, with pointed ears and what appeared to be a muzzle full of prominent teeth. The creature moved with fluid grace, sometimes upright on 2 legs, sometimes dropping to all fours with no apparent effort. But what impressed me most was the intelligence it demonstrated, systematic evaluation of the farm security, apparent understanding of electric fencing, and careful assessment of the livestock before making any approach. When it became aware of my observation, it turned and looked directly at my patrol vehicle. The eyes reflected my infrared illuminator with an amber glow, and there was recognition there, understanding that it was being watched by someone who represented authority and potential threat. But instead of fleeing, it held my gaze for several minutes, as if evaluating me in the same way it had been studying the livestock. Then it made a sound that my recording equipment captured clearly, a vocalization that was part growl, part howl, but with inflections that sounded almost like speech. It moved away from the fence line and disappeared into the forest with speed and silence that seemed impossible for something that large. But the message was clear. It was aware of my presence and had made a deliberate decision to avoid confrontation rather than being driven away by fear. I filed my investigation report with the DNR, documenting the livestock kills and recommending enhanced security measures for farms in the area. But I was careful about how I described the physical evidence and witness statements, focusing on the need for additional resources rather than specific claims about unknown species. The livestock attack stopped after my surveillance activities became known in the area, but I continued to receive occasional reports of sightings from residents who were comfortable sharing their experiences with law enforcement. I retired from the DNR 2 years later and now work as a security consultant for agricultural operations throughout Michigan. When farmers ask about protecting livestock from unusual predation, I recommend motion-activated lights, enhanced fencing, and security cameras rather than discussing the specific nature of threats they might encounter. But I still keep the plaster cast from that Wexford County investigation, and sometimes I wonder what other DNR officers might have encountered during their careers that didn't make it into official reports. Story 6. The Snowmobile Trail Groomer. Maintaining snowmobile trails through the remote forests of northern Michigan during winter requires working alone in areas where you might not see another person for days. I'd been grooming trails for the Manistee County Snowmobile Association for 6 years and thought I understood what kinds of wildlife activity to expect during overnight trail maintenance. That assumption was shattered during a job in February 2 years ago when I was 41 and discovered that some creatures have very specific opinions about human activities in their territory. My responsibility was maintaining a 60-mile network of snowmobile trails that connected several small communities northeast of Cadillac. The work involved operating a heavy grooming machine, essentially a bulldozer with a tiller attachment, to break up ice, pack powder snow, and create smooth surfaces for recreational snowmobiling. Most of the grooming was done at night when trails weren't being used by riders. The work was solitary but peaceful, spending hours moving through snow-covered forests under clear winter skies, occasionally seeing deer or other wildlife in the headlights of the grooming machine. The trail system I was working included some of the most remote forest areas in Manistee County, including sections that ran through state land, where hunting and trapping were the only human activities most of the year. On the night I'm describing, I was grooming Trail 7, a 15-mile section that wound through dense pine and hardwood forest, with no road access for most of its length. The temperature was around -10 Fahrenheit, and snow conditions were perfect for creating an excellent riding surface. About 8 miles into the trail, I started noticing tracks that were following the groomed path. At first, I thought they might be from wolves or coyotes using the packed snow for easier travel, but the prints were much too large for any known canine species in Michigan. The tracks were enormous, at least 14 inches long, and showed something that had been walking upright on 2 legs, following the exact path that my grooming machine had created. The stride length indicated something over 7 feet tall, and the depth of the print suggested considerable weight. What made the tracking more disturbing was the intelligence it demonstrated. The creature was using the groomed trail for efficient travel, but staying just far enough behind my grooming machine to avoid direct encounter while still following my work pattern. I stopped the groomer and used my headlamp to examine the tracks more closely. What I found convinced me that I was dealing with something that combined human intelligence with physical capabilities that exceeded any known Michigan wildlife. The footprints showed clear toe marks ending in claws, but the overall shape suggested feet that had both human and canine characteristics. More importantly, they were accompanied by handprints, where the creature had apparently tested the snow consistency and grooming quality. The handprints showed fingers that were too long and ended in claws, but they also demonstrated opposable thumbs and clear evidence of manipulative ability. Whatever was making these tracks was evaluating my work with obvious understanding of trail grooming techniques. I radioed my supervisor, Bill Murphy, who coordinated trail maintenance activities throughout the county. Bill, I'm seeing some unusual wildlife activity on Trail 7. Large tracks following the groomed path, bigger than anything I've encountered before. Probably moose, Bill responded. They'll use groomed trails when the snow gets deep. Nothing to worry about as long as you maintain distance if you encounter one directly. But I'd seen moose tracks before, and these were different. The gait pattern, the size, and the apparent intelligence of the trail usage suggested something that understood human trail grooming and was deliberately following my work. I continued grooming, but I started noticing that the tracks were getting fresher. The creature was closing the distance between us, apparently timing its movement to stay just behind my grooming machine. Around 2 a.m., while I was working a section of trail that ran along a frozen creek, I became aware that I was no longer alone on the trail. In my mirrors, I could see something large keeping pace with the grooming machine, staying just at the edge of my work lights. I stopped the groomer and looked back, but whatever was following me had also stopped and was staying just outside clear visibility. But I could see amber-colored eye shine reflecting my lights, positioned at a height that suggested something much taller than any known Michigan wildlife. I started the groomer and continued working, but I kept watching my mirrors. The eye shine stayed with me for the next several miles, maintaining exactly the same distance and apparently studying my grooming techniques with obvious interest. Around 4 a.m., the creature made its first direct approach. I was working a particularly challenging section of trail, steep terrain with several tight curves, when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Something was running alongside the grooming machine, keeping pace with my 8 km/h travel speed, but moving with a fluid grace that didn't match any animal I knew in winter conditions. Through the side windows of the groomer cab, I could see it clearly for the first time. 7 feet tall, maybe more, with a muscular human-like torso covered in dark fur. But the head was unmistakably canine, with pointed ears and what appeared to be a muzzle full of prominent teeth. What struck me most were the eyes. They glowed with their own amber light and tracked my movements with intelligence that was definitely not animal. There was curiosity there, evaluation, and something that might have been professional interest in my trail grooming work. The creature ran alongside the groomer for nearly a mile, occasionally looking through the windows at me, sometimes studying the grooming equipment and the trail surface being created. It showed no aggression, but there was something in its attention that suggested I was being evaluated for purposes I couldn't understand. Then it did something that violated my understanding of wildlife behavior. It moved ahead of the grooming machine and began running down the center of the ungroomed trail, apparently demonstrating the route I should follow and showing me areas where the terrain required special attention. For the next several miles, it served as a guide, staying ahead of my machine and indicating optimal grooming paths through difficult terrain. The level of understanding it demonstrated about trail maintenance and snow conditions was remarkable. When I reached the end of Trail 7 and began loading my grooming equipment onto the transport trailer, the creature approached one final time. It stood at the forest edge, about 50 yards away, and watched my shutdown procedures with obvious interest. As I prepared to drive back to the maintenance facility, it raised one hand in what appeared to be a farewell gesture. Not random animal movement, but deliberate acknowledgement of our shared work on the trail system. I completed my grooming schedule for the rest of the winter, but I never again encountered the creature that had served as my guide that February night. The trails I maintained received excellent reviews from snowmobile clubs for surface quality and route optimization. When other trail groomers asked about working the remote sections of the county trail system, I would mention the beauty of winter forest work and the satisfaction of creating excellent riding conditions. Some experiences are too far outside normal reality to discuss in professional context. But I always wondered whether that creature had been protecting its territory or genuinely trying to help improve trail conditions for recreational users. The intelligence and cooperative behavior it demonstrated suggested motivations that went beyond simple wildlife responses to human activity. Story 7. The Emergency Medical Technician. Working as an EMT in rural Wisconsin means responding to medical emergencies in areas where the nearest hospital might be an hour away and backup could take even longer. During my 8 years with Walworth County Emergency Medical Services, I'd handled everything from farm accidents to heart attacks in locations that were miles from civilization. But one call I responded to near Elkhorn changed my understanding of what kinds of dangers we might encounter in the remote areas around Bray Road. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Saturday in late September. Motor vehicle accident with injuries on Bray Road, about 4 miles south of Elkhorn. The dispatcher provided coordinates from a cell phone GPS, but warned that the caller was difficult to understand and seemed to be in severe distress. I was working with my partner, Dave Martinez, who'd been an EMT for over 15 years and had experience with the kind of isolated accident scenes that were common in Walworth County's rural areas. We responded with full emergency equipment, advanced life support gear, trauma supplies, and everything needed for extended patient care in remote locations. The drive took about 20 minutes through winding country roads, and we used the time to discuss approach strategies for accident scenes in areas where additional hazards might complicate our response. When we reached the coordinates, we found a silver pickup truck in the ditch beside Bray Road, engine running, headlights on, driver's door standing open. The vehicle showed no obvious collision damage, but there were deep scratches along the passenger side that looked like they'd been made by something with very large claws. We approached the scene using standard safety protocols, but there was no sign of the person who'd called 911. The truck's interior showed evidence of hasty exit. Keys still in the ignition, cell phone on the seat, wallet and personal items scattered around the cab. Dave checked the immediate area around the vehicle, while I radioed dispatch to confirm we were at the correct location and request law enforcement backup. Unit 47, we have the vehicle, but no patient visible. Requesting sheriff's deputy for scene security and possible missing person situation. Copy Unit 47. Sheriff's unit en route. ETA about 15 minutes. While we waited for the deputy, I noticed something that made me reconsider what might have caused this accident scene. The scratches on the truck weren't from collision damage or normal wear. They were deep gouges in the metal that showed a deliberate pattern, as if something with claws had been testing the vehicle's structural integrity. Around the truck, I found footprints in the soft earth that were unlike anything I'd seen in 8 years of rural emergency response. The tracks were enormous, at least 12 inches long, and showed something that had been walking upright on 2 legs. But the most disturbing aspect was what the tracks revealed about the sequence of events. They approached the truck from the forest, circled the vehicle several times, then led away from the road toward a dense stand of oak trees. Mixed with the unusual tracks were human footprints showing someone running in obvious panic. The stride length and depth indicated desperate flight, with several areas where the person had apparently fallen and scrambled back to their feet. Dave completed his search of the immediate area and confirmed that whoever had called 911 was no longer in the vicinity of the truck. "The caller is gone," he reported, "but there's a clear trail leading into the forest, and it looks like whoever made it was running for their life." Deputy Tom Rodriguez arrived and immediately took charge of what was now a potential missing person investigation rather than a medical emergency. But Tom was familiar with the area around Bray Road and had responded to similar calls involving abandoned vehicles and terrified drivers. "This is the third call like this in the past 2 months," he told us. "Vehicle found abandoned, driver gone, evidence of something with claws investigating the scene, but we've never found any of the missing people." Tom used his spotlight to examine the claw marks on the truck and the unusual footprints around the accident scene. As someone who'd worked rural law enforcement for over 12 years, he recognized signs that went beyond normal emergency response. These scratches were made by something much larger than any known Wisconsin wildlife, he concluded, and the tracks suggest whatever made them was walking upright most of the time. While Tom documented the scene for his investigation, Dave and I followed the trail leading into the forest, hoping to find an injured person who might need medical attention. The trail was easy to follow for about 100 yards. Broken branches, disturbed vegetation, and the desperate footprints of someone running through the woods in darkness. But then the human tracks ended abruptly in a small clearing. What we found in that clearing convinced me that our missing person had encountered something that went beyond normal wildlife or criminal activity. The clearing showed signs of a struggle, disturbed ground, broken branches, pieces of torn clothing scattered around the area. But there was no blood, no body, no evidence of what had happened to the person we were supposed to be treating. Instead, there were more of the enormous footprints, showing something that had been in the clearing for an extended period. The tracks suggested whatever made them had been examining the area systematically, apparently searching for something or someone. Dave, who'd been an EMT longer than I had and had seen more accident scenes, was clearly disturbed by what we'd found. "This doesn't match any emergency response I've handled," he told me. "The pattern suggests predation, but there's no body, no blood trail, no evidence of what happened to our patient." We returned to the accident scene and reported our findings to Deputy Rodriguez, who had completed his documentation of the vehicle and the unusual evidence around it. "This is consistent with other incidents we've been investigating in the Bray Road area," Tom told us. "Abandoned vehicles, missing drivers, and evidence of encounters with something that doesn't fit standard categories of wildlife or criminal activity." Tom arranged for the truck to be towed and began the process of filing a missing person report. But he also shared information that wasn't included in the official documentation. "We've had 8 similar incidents in the past year," he explained. "Drivers who called 911 reporting something attacking their vehicles, then disappeared before we could respond. None of the missing people have been found, but all the scenes show the same pattern of evidence." The missing person from our call was never located, despite extensive search efforts involving K9 units, helicopter surveillance, and volunteer teams. The official investigation concluded that the driver had abandoned the vehicle for unknown reasons and disappeared into the forest. But Tom shared his unofficial theory with us during a follow-up conversation. "I think something in the Bray Road area has learned to associate vehicle breakdowns with opportunities to encounter isolated humans," he said. "The claw marks suggest systematic testing of vehicle security, and the pattern of missing people suggests predation rather than random encounters. I continued working as an EMT for Walworth County for another 2 years, but I was always more cautious about responding to calls in remote areas, especially around Bray Road. When newer EMTs asked about rural response protocols, I emphasized the importance of scene safety and waiting for law enforcement backup in areas where animal activity might pose additional hazards. But I never forgot that September night and the evidence we found in the forest clearing. Signs of a struggle with something that was intelligent enough to hunt humans systematically and powerful enough to make people disappear without leaving the kind of evidence that would appear in official reports. Story 8. The Utility Line Inspector. Inspecting electrical transmission lines through remote forest areas requires working alone in the territories where the nearest help might be hours away. During my 9 years as a power line inspector for Michigan Electric Cooperative, I developed efficient routines for checking equipment and documenting maintenance needs in areas that saw very little human activity. But during a routine inspection job in the Manistee National Forest 3 years ago, when I was 37, I discovered that some areas of Michigan's wilderness have inhabitants who take a very personal interest in utility infrastructure. The job was a quarterly inspection of a 46 kV transmission line that ran for about 30 miles through dense forest between substations near Baldwin and Wellston. The route followed an easement that had been cleared decades earlier, creating a corridor through otherwise unbroken woodland. My responsibility was to check each transmission tower for equipment problems, vegetation encroachment, and wildlife interference. The work involved hiking between towers with test equipment, climbing structures to examine insulators and hardware, and documenting any issues that required repair or maintenance. I'd inspected this particular line dozens of times over the years and knew every mile of the route. It was beautiful country, rolling forest with occasional clearings, scattered wetlands, and wildlife that was comfortable enough with minimal human presence to be easily observed during inspection walks. The line inspection I'm describing took place in early November, when most recreational users had finished their seasonal activities and the forest was settling into winter quiet. I was working alone, which was standard for routine inspections, carrying radio equipment for communication with the dispatch office. For the first day and a half, the inspection went exactly as planned. I found minor vegetation issues, documented a few insulators that needed cleaning, and noted some woodpecker damage to wooden crossarms that would require repair crews. The transmission towers were numbered sequentially along the route, and I was making good time checking equipment and updating maintenance records. Tower 23, located about 15 miles from the nearest road access, marked the halfway point of my inspection route. It was at Tower 23 that I first noticed I wasn't alone in monitoring the transmission line. While I was climbing the structure to examine insulators, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something large moving through the forest parallel to the power line corridor. At first, I thought it might be a deer or elk using the cleared easement for travel, but whatever was moving through the trees was too large and moved with coordination that suggested intelligence rather than typical animal behavior. I completed my work on Tower 23 and continued to Tower 24, about a half-mile further along the route. As I hiked between structures, I became increasingly aware that something was keeping pace with my progress, staying just inside the forest but following my exact route along the transmission line. At Tower 24, I found evidence that my work was under systematic observation. The tower showed signs of recent examination, handprints on the steel framework, disturbed vegetation around the base structure, and what appeared to be claw marks on the wooden crossarms. The handprints were much larger than human normal, with fingers that seemed too long and showed clear evidence of claws. But they also demonstrated opposable thumbs and careful manipulation of the tower hardware, as if someone had been trying to understand how the electrical system functioned. Most disturbing was the pattern of examination. Whoever or whatever had been investigating the tower had focused specifically on the electrical components, insulators, conductor connections, and grounding systems. The level of interest suggested understanding of electrical infrastructure that went beyond casual curiosity. I radioed my supervisor, Karen Walsh, to report unusual wildlife activity in the inspection area. Karen, I'm seeing signs of large animal investigation at Tower 24. Something's been examining the electrical equipment pretty systematically. Probably bears, she responded. They're curious about human installations, and they'll investigate anything that's new or different in their territory. Just maintain distance if you encounter one directly. But I'd seen bear sign before, and this was different. The examination pattern, the size of the handprints, and the specific focus on electrical components suggested something with problem-solving abilities and technical curiosity that exceeded typical wildlife behavior. I continued my inspection to Tower 25, where I found more evidence of intelligent investigation. This tower showed even more extensive examination, with clear signs that someone had been testing the structural stability in electrical connections. What made this discovery particularly unsettling was the sophistication of the investigation. The examiner had apparently understood which components were critical to system operation and had focused attention on insulators, conductor connections, and protection equipment. It was while I was documenting the evidence at Tower 25 that I had my first direct encounter with whatever had been studying the transmission line. I was about 40 feet up the tower structure, examining insulator hardware, when I became aware that I was being watched from the forest floor. Looking down, I could see a tall figure standing at the edge of the cleared corridor, apparently studying my inspection procedures. The figure was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, with a muscular torso covered in dark brown fur, but the head was unmistakably canine, with pointed ears and what appeared to be a prominent muzzle. What struck me most were the eyes. They glowed with their own amber light and tracked my movements with obvious intelligence. There was recognition there, understanding that I was performing technical work, and something that looked like professional interest in electrical infrastructure. We observed each other for several minutes. The creature showed no aggression or fear, but there was an intensity in its attention that suggested I was being evaluated for purposes I couldn't understand. Then it did something that challenged my assumptions about wildlife behavior. It approached the base of the tower and began examining the grounding system and guy wire anchors with obvious understanding of their function in the electrical system. Using hands that were clearly not paws, it tested the connections and seemed to evaluate the structural integrity of the installation. The level of technical comprehension it demonstrated was remarkable. When I called down to identify myself as a utility worker performing routine maintenance, the creature looked up at me with what appeared to be acknowledgement. It made no aggressive moves, but continued its systematic examination of the tower structure. For nearly 20 minutes, it conducted what could only be described as its own inspection of Tower 25, paying particular attention to components that were critical for system reliability. Then it moved away from the tower and disappeared into the forest, with speed and stealth that seemed impossible for something that large. I completed my inspection of the remaining towers, but I found evidence at each location that they had been subjected to similar examination. The pattern suggested systematic evaluation of the entire transmission system by something with obvious understanding of electrical infrastructure. When I filed my inspection report, I focused on the routine maintenance issues and equipment conditions. I mentioned wildlife activity, but avoided specific details about the intelligence and technical sophistication I'd observed. The transmission line continues to operate reliably, but inspection procedures for that route have been modified to include two-person teams and enhanced communication protocols. The official reason is improved safety procedures. But those of us who work remote utility infrastructure understand that some areas require additional precautions. I still work power line inspection, but I'm more aware of the possibility that utility infrastructure in remote areas might attract attention from entities with their own interest in electrical systems and technical operations. Some encounters with wildlife are better approached with backup and the understanding that you might be sharing the forest with intelligence that exceeds anything covered in standard safety training. Story 9. The Hunting Guide. Guiding hunters through Michigan's remote forest areas during deer season means knowing the territory, understanding animal behavior, and ensuring client safety in environments where help might be hours away. I'd been working as a licensed hunting guide in the Manistee National Forest for 11 years and thought I understood what kinds of wildlife encounters we might have during extended backcountry hunts. That assumption was challenged during a 5-day guided hunt in November, 2 years ago, when I was 43, and discovered that some predators in Michigan's forests don't follow any rules covered in hunting safety courses. My clients were 2 experienced hunters from Ohio, Robert Chen, a retired engineer, and his son Michael, who was starting his 3rd year of serious bow hunting. They'd booked a premium guided hunt that included camping in remote areas and tracking mature bucks in sections of the national forest that saw minimal hunting pressure. I'd scouted the area extensively before their arrival and had identified several locations where large deer were feeding and moving between bedding and water sources. The terrain was perfect for archery hunting. Dense oak and maple forest with natural clearings that provided good visibility and shooting opportunities. We established our base camp about 8 miles from the nearest forest road in an area that I'd used successfully for previous hunts. The camp included heated tents, cooking facilities, and all the equipment needed for extended wilderness hunting. The first 2 days of the hunt went exactly as planned. We were seeing good deer activity, and both clients had opportunities at mature bucks. The weather was perfect for November hunting. Temperatures in the 30s, light wind, and clear skies that provided excellent visibility during legal hunting hours. But during our 3rd day, we started noticing changes in deer behavior that suggested the presence of a large predator in our hunting area. Animals that had been moving predictably were suddenly absent from their normal feeding and travel routes. Michael, who was hunting from a tree stand about a 1/4 mile from camp, reported seeing deer fleeing through the forest in obvious panic during the early morning hours. They weren't just spooked, he told me. These animals were running like something was actively hunting them. And it wasn't normal predator-prey behavior. They seemed terrified. Robert, who was hunting a different area about a 1/2 mile away, made similar observations about abnormal deer activity. Something has moved into this area that's got all the game animals on edge, he reported. I've been hunting for over 20 years, and I've never seen deer act this nervous. That afternoon, while I was scouting for evening hunting locations, I found tracks that explained the changed animal behavior. Footprints that were much larger than any known Michigan predator, showing something that walked upright on two legs, but occasionally dropped to all fours. The tracks were enormous, at least 14 inches long, and showed clear claw marks, but they also demonstrated a gait pattern and stride length that indicated something over 7 feet tall. They were accompanied by what appeared to be handprints, showing fingers with claws but also clear evidence of opposable thumbs. What made the tracking more disturbing was the intelligence it demonstrated. The creature was following deer trails with obvious understanding of animal behavior, positioning itself at natural funnels and ambush points that showed sophisticated hunting strategy. I found kill sites that didn't match any known predation patterns in Michigan forests. Deer carcasses that had been systematically butchered, with meat removed using techniques that suggested tools rather than teeth and claws. The kills showed precision that exceeded anything I'd seen from bears, coyotes, or other natural predators. That evening, I discussed the situation with my clients over dinner at our base camp. We have a large predator in the area, I told them. Something that's affecting normal deer movement and might pose safety concerns for our hunting activities. Robert, who had extensive hunting experience, was interested in the tactical implications of sharing the forest with an unknown predator. "What kind of animal behavior are we talking about?" he asked. "Bear, wolves, something else?" I showed them photos of the tracks and kill sites I'd found, and both clients immediately recognized that we were dealing with something outside their hunting experience. "Those tracks are from something that's hunting with intelligence and planning," Michael observed. "This isn't random predation. It's systematic hunting strategy." That night, our discussion became academic when we had direct encounters with whatever had been disrupting the local deer population. Around 10 p.m., while we were reviewing hunting plans for the following day, we heard sounds from the forest around our camp that didn't match normal woodland activity. Heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush, but with coordination that suggested deliberate approach rather than random animal movement. Robert, who had military experience, immediately recognized the tactical implications of our situation. "Something's conducting reconnaissance of our camp," he told me. "The movement pattern suggests intelligence and purpose, not typical animal curiosity." We could hear the footsteps circling our camp, sometimes approaching close enough that we could see movement at the edge of our campfire light. But whatever was out there stayed just beyond clear visibility, apparently studying our activities without revealing itself. Around midnight, we heard vocalizations that convinced all three of us that we were dealing with something that challenged normal categories of wildlife. Low growling that rose to sounds that were almost like speech. Rumbling vocalizations that had rhythm and inflection, but weren't recognizable as any known animal communication. The sounds seemed to come from multiple directions around our camp, suggesting either multiple animals or one creature that was moving with remarkable speed and stealth through the forest. Michael, who was monitoring our perimeter with night vision equipment, reported sightings that confirmed our worst concerns about what was sharing the forest with us. "I can see something at the tree line," he whispered. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, walking upright, but definitely not human. It's watching our camp and appears to be evaluating our activities. Through the night vision scope, he could see amber-colored eyes reflecting infrared illumination, positioned at a height that confirmed we were being observed by something much larger than typical Michigan wildlife. The creature remained active around our camp throughout the night, occasionally approaching close enough that we could hear breathing and movement just beyond our perimeter lighting. But it showed no aggressive behavior. Instead, it seemed curious about our hunting equipment and camp setup, apparently trying to understand what we were doing in its territory. At dawn, we found evidence that confirmed Michael's night observations, large footprints around our camp showing systematic reconnaissance of our activities. The creature had examined our hunting equipment, studied our tent arrangement, and apparently evaluated our capabilities and potential threat level. I made the decision to end the hunt early and escort my clients back to civilization. While we broke camp, the creature remained visible at the forest edge, watching our departure preparations with obvious interest. As we hiked out towards our vehicle access point, it followed our progress, staying parallel to our route and maintaining visual contact throughout our retreat from its territory. Both clients were understanding about the abbreviated hunt and expressed interest in the wildlife behavior we documented. But they also agreed that continuing the hunt would have involved risks that went beyond normal hunting safety considerations. I continued working as a hunting guide, but I was more selective about accepting bookings for extended backcountry hunts in the most remote areas of the Manistee National Forest. When other guides asked about hunting in areas where clients reported unusual wildlife activity, I recommended focusing on locations closer to forest roads and avoiding areas where local deer populations showed signs of extreme stress. Some hunting experiences involve more than just pursuing game animals. They require understanding that you might be sharing the forest with predators that have their own hunting strategies and territorial priorities. Story 10. The Forest Service Firefighter. Fighting wildfires in Michigan's remote forest areas means working in conditions where visibility is limited, terrain is dangerous, and wildlife can pose additional hazards to fire suppression crews. During my 12 years with the U.S. Forest Service, I'd handled fires throughout the Great Lakes region and thought I understood what kinds of challenges we might encounter in backcountry fire suppression operations. But during a wildfire response in the Manistee National Forest 4 years ago, when I was 34, I discovered that some forest inhabitants have their own relationship with fire that doesn't match anything covered in firefighter training. The fire started from a lightning strike during a severe thunderstorm in late July, a fast-moving blaze that threatened to burn through several thousand acres of mixed hardwood and pine forest. Our crew was dispatched as part of an initial attack team to establish fire breaks and begin suppression operations before the fire could spread beyond containment. I was working as a squad boss, responsible for a 6-person crew that included both experienced firefighters and seasonal employees who were developing their wildland firefighting skills. We were equipped with hand tools, portable pumps, and communication equipment that allowed coordination with air support and incident command. The fire area was in a remote section of the National Forest, accessible only by forest roads and requiring helicopter support for crew transportation and supply delivery. The terrain was challenging, rolling hills covered with dense vegetation that provided significant fuel for fire spread. Our assignment was to establish a containment line on the fire's northern perimeter, working through dense forest to create defensible space and prevent the fire from reaching a series of recreational areas and private property. For the first 2 days, the fire suppression went according to standard procedures. We made good progress on containment lines, received effective air support, and maintained communication with other crews working different sections of the fire perimeter. But during our 3rd day on the fire, we started noticing animal behavior that was unusual for wildfire conditions. Instead of fleeing the fire area as expected, some wildlife appeared to be moving toward the fire rather than away from it. Jake Morrison, one of my crew members with 8 years of firefighting experience, reported seeing large animals moving through burned areas that should have been abandoned by wildlife. "There's something moving through the black," he told me, referring to areas that had already been burned, too big for deer or elk, and it's not showing normal fire avoidance behavior. Fire creates thermal barriers that drive wildlife away from burned areas. But Jake was describing movement patterns that suggested some animals were actually attracted to fire activity rather than avoiding it. Tom Bradley, another experienced crew member, made similar observations while working our containment line. "I keep seeing movement in the smoke," he reported. "Something large that seems comfortable in conditions that would drive normal wildlife miles away from the fire area." Wildlife behavior around forest fires is usually predictable. Animals flee ahead of the fire front and don't return until conditions have stabilized and vegetation begins recovering. But our crew was documenting activity that suggested some creatures were actively investigating fire suppression operations. That evening, while we were establishing our overnight camp in a safety zone away from active fire, we encountered direct evidence of what had been moving through the burned areas. We found tracks in the ash and soft soil that were unlike anything in my 12 years of wildland firefighting. Footprints that were enormous, at least 14 inches long, showing something that walked upright on 2 legs, but occasionally dropped to all 4s. The tracks led directly through areas that had been burned within the past 24 hours, where ground temperatures were still hot enough to be dangerous for normal wildlife. Whatever was making these prints was either immune to heat that would injure most animals, or had protective adaptations that allowed movement through recently burned terrain. Most disturbing was the intelligence the tracking demonstrated. The creature was following our containment lines with obvious understanding of fire suppression strategy, apparently studying our work methods and evaluating our progress on fire control. Sarah Chen, our crew medic who had worked fires throughout the western United States, examined the tracks and couldn't explain what we were finding. These prints show movement through areas where the ground temperature would cause severe burns to unprotected feet, she observed. Whatever made these tracks has either developed protective adaptations or has pain tolerance that exceeds anything in normal wildlife. That night, our camp was visited by whatever had been tracking our fire suppression activities. Around 2 a.m., while we were maintaining fire watch rotation, we heard sounds that didn't match normal post-fire wildlife behavior. Heavy footsteps moving around our camp perimeter, but with deliberate stealth that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random animal movement. The sounds would approach close enough that we could sense presence just beyond our perimeter lighting, then withdraw when anyone tried to investigate. Dave Williams, who was on fire watch duty, reported seeing amber-colored eye shine reflecting our camp lights from positions that indicated something much taller than typical Michigan wildlife. "There's something out there that's studying our camp," he told me, not showing fear of fire or human presence, just systematic observation of our activities. Around 3 a.m., we heard vocalizations that convinced our entire crew that we were dealing with something outside normal firefighting experience. Sounds that were part growl, part howl, but with inflections that seemed almost like speech. The vocalizations had rhythm and pattern that suggested communication, possibly between multiple individuals coordinating their observation of our fire camp. Mike Santos, our most experienced firefighter, with over 15 years of wildland fire suppression, had never encountered similar wildlife behavior around active fires. Normal animals flee fire areas and don't return until vegetation recovery begins, he told me. This behavior suggests something that's either attracted to fire activity or has territorial motivations that override normal fire avoidance instincts. The next morning, we found evidence around our camp that confirmed our night observations. Large footprints showing systematic reconnaissance of our fire suppression equipment and camp facilities. But what was most remarkable was the apparent understanding demonstrated of firefighting operations. The tracks focused on areas where we stored our pumps, hoses, and communication equipment, as if the examiner understood which components were critical to fire suppression activities. I reported the unusual wildlife activity to our incident commander, focusing on potential safety implications for crew operations rather than specific details about what we might be encountering. Our fire suppression was successful, and the blaze was contained within 4 days without loss of structures or injuries to personnel. But the incident commander acknowledged that several crews had reported similar unusual wildlife activity during the suppression effort. After the fire was controlled, I discussed our encounters with other squad bosses and crew leaders. Similar reports came from multiple crews. Large animals showing no fear of fire, tracks through burned areas, and systematic observation of fire suppression operations. But these experiences were documented as unusual wildlife behavior rather than specific encounters with unknown species. Fire incident reports focus on suppression effectiveness and safety outcomes, not wildlife biology. I continued working wildland firefighting for another 2 seasons before transferring to fire prevention and education programs that involved less time in remote backcountry conditions. When new firefighters asked about wildlife encounters during fire suppression, I emphasized the importance of situational awareness and understanding that fire conditions can cause unpredictable animal behavior. But I never forgot those nights in the Manistee National Forest, listening to vocalizations that sounded like intelligent communication from creatures that seemed to view our fire suppression efforts with professional interest rather than fear or territorial aggression. Story 11. The road construction foreman. Building and maintaining roads through Michigan's remote forest areas requires working in locations where the nearest town might be 30 miles away, and cell phone service is non-existent. During my 16 years as a construction foreman for the Michigan Department of Transportation, I'd supervised crews building forest roads, maintaining bridges, and upgrading infrastructure in areas that saw very little human activity. But during a road improvement project in Wexford County 4 years ago, when I was 45, I discovered that some areas of Michigan's wilderness have inhabitants who take a very personal interest in human construction activities. The project was a routine road upgrade, improving drainage and resurfacing about 12 miles of forest road that provided access to recreational areas and timber management sites in the Manistee National Forest. The work required heavy equipment, material hauling, and a crew of 8 men working 10-hour shifts over a 6-week period. We'd established a construction camp near the midpoint of the project, with trailers for the crew, equipment storage, and a temporary office for managing daily operations. The location was remote, but accessible by existing forest roads, allowing us to bring in the dozers, graders, and paving equipment needed for the road improvement. My crew consisted of experienced construction workers who specialized in forest road projects. Pete Kowalski, heavy equipment operator, Jake Morrison, truck driver, Tom Bradley, equipment maintenance, Dave Williams, surveyor, Mike Santos, materials coordinator, Frank Chen, safety officer, and 2 seasonal workers who were learning forest construction techniques. The terrain was typical northern Michigan forest, rolling hills covered with oak, maple, and pine, intersected by creeks and wetland areas that required careful engineering to maintain proper drainage and road stability. For the first 2 weeks, construction proceeded exactly as planned. We made good progress on drainage improvements, and the crew worked efficiently despite the challenges of operating heavy equipment in remote forest conditions. But during our 3rd week, we started noticing that our construction activities were under systematic observation by something that demonstrated unusual interest in road building operations. Equipment left overnight showed signs of examination, handprints on surfaces, disturbed materials, and evidence that someone had been testing the function and capabilities of our construction machinery. Pete, who operated our main dozer and had 20 years of construction experience, was first to report the unusual activity. "Something's been messing with my dozer during the night," he told me. "Not damaging it, but examining the controls, hydraulic systems, and blade mechanisms, like someone's trying to understand how the machine works." The examination pattern Pete described showed intelligence and technical curiosity that exceeded anything we'd encountered in previous forest construction projects. The investigator had focused specifically on operational components and seemed to understand which systems were critical for earth-moving operations. Jake, who hauled materials and operated our dump trucks, reported similar experiences with his equipment. "Someone's been going through my truck systematically," he said, "checking the dump mechanism, examining the load capacity, studying the hydraulic controls, but nothing's damaged or missing." The level of technical interest suggested understanding of construction methods and equipment capabilities that went beyond casual curiosity about human activities. Tom, our equipment maintenance specialist, found evidence that convinced me our construction operations were being studied by something with engineering knowledge. "Whatever's examining our equipment has a clear understanding of mechanical systems," he reported. "The investigation pattern shows someone who recognizes critical components and understands how they function together." Tom had found handprints on engine covers, hydraulic reservoirs, and control systems that indicated systematic technical analysis rather than random animal curiosity. But the handprints were much larger than human normal, with fingers that were too long and showed clear evidence of claws. They demonstrated opposable thumbs and manipulative ability, but the size suggested something over 7 feet tall, with handspan that exceeded typical human proportions. During our 4th week, the systematic observation escalated to direct encounters that challenged our understanding of what kinds of wildlife might be sharing the forest with our construction operations. Dave, who was conducting survey work about a mile from our main construction area, reported seeing something that made him reconsider what might be monitoring our road building activities. "There's something in the forest that's following my survey work," he told me. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, but walking upright like a human. It stays just inside the tree line, but it's definitely tracking my progress and studying my surveying techniques. Dave described encounters with the creature that showed obvious understanding of construction surveying, an apparent interest in how we determined road alignment and elevation changes. "It watches me use survey equipment with clear comprehension of what I'm doing," he continued, "and it seems to understand the relationship between surveying and the actual road construction work. The intelligence Dave was describing exceeded anything we'd encountered in 16 years of forest construction projects. Wildlife curiosity about human activities was common, but systematic study of engineering methods suggested cognitive abilities that challenged normal categories of animal behavior. That evening, while our crew was having dinner at the construction camp, we had our first group encounter with whatever had been studying our road building operations. Around 8 p.m., while we were discussing the next day's work schedule, we became aware that we were being observed from the forest surrounding our camp. Through the windows of our temporary office trailer, we could see movement at the tree line, something large that was watching our activities with obvious interest. Pete, who had experience with wildlife encounters during previous construction projects, used binoculars to get a clearer look at what was observing us. "That's not any animal I've seen in 30 years of forest work," he reported. "It's standing upright, maybe 8 feet tall, with a body structure that's part human, part animal, and is looking at our construction equipment with what appears to be professional interest." Through the binoculars, Pete could see amber-colored eyes that reflected our camp lighting and tracked our movements with intelligence that was clearly not animal. Jake, who was monitoring our equipment yard, reported that our observer had been joined by at least 2 other similar creatures. "They're conducting what looks like a technical assessment of our construction capabilities," he told me. "Moving between machines, studying different equipment types, apparently evaluating our road building methods." For nearly 2 hours, the creatures maintained their observation of our camp and equipment, occasionally moving closer for better examination of specific machinery, sometimes withdrawing to discuss what appeared to be technical evaluations of our construction operations. The level of intelligence and apparent technical interest they demonstrated was remarkable. They seemed to understand the relationship between different pieces of equipment and the overall road construction process. Frank, our safety officer, made the observation that shaped my understanding of what we were encountering. "These aren't random wildlife encounters," he told me. "This is systematic study of human engineering by something that has its own understanding of construction methods and possibly its own construction capabilities." The creatures remained active around our construction camp until about 11 p.m, when they gradually withdrew into the forest. But they left clear evidence of their technical investigation: handprints on equipment, disturbed materials, and signs of systematic examination of our road building operations. The next morning, we found more evidence of overnight activity around our construction site. The creatures had examined our completed roadwork, apparently analyzing our construction techniques and evaluating the quality of our engineering. But they had also left what appeared to be suggestions for improvement: areas where drainage could be enhanced, curves that could be optimized for better vehicle flow, and sections where our engineering could be modified for greater environmental compatibility. The suggestions demonstrated understanding of road construction principles that exceeded the knowledge level of many professional engineers. I completed the road improvement project on schedule and within budget, but I filed my final report with careful attention to how I described the unusual aspects of working in that particular area of Wexford County. The Michigan Department of Transportation continues to maintain forest roads throughout the area, but construction projects in the most remote sections are now assigned to crews with experience in unusual conditions and enhanced safety protocols. When other construction foremen ask about working in areas where local people report unusual wildlife activity, I recommend focusing on the engineering challenges and emphasizing crew safety, rather than discussing the possibility that your work might be under professional evaluation by entities with their own construction capabilities. Some forest road projects involve more than just building infrastructure. They require understanding that you might be working in territories where other engineers have been developing their own relationship with the landscape for much longer than humans have been building roads through Michigan's forests. Story 12. The Park Maintenance Worker. Maintaining state park facilities in Michigan's remote recreational areas means working alone in locations where you might not see another person for days, especially during off-season periods when visitor activity is minimal. I'd been working park maintenance for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources for 9 years and thought I understood what kinds of challenges I might encounter while servicing facilities in areas that were miles from the nearest town. But during routine maintenance work at a state park in Newaygo County 3 years ago, when I was 33, I discovered that some park residents have very specific opinions about human modifications to their habitat. The park where this incident occurred was a 4,000-acre facility that included camping areas, hiking trails, and recreational facilities built around a large lake. During winter months, the park was officially closed to camping, but I was responsible for maintaining buildings, checking equipment, and preparing facilities for the upcoming season. My work involved routine maintenance tasks, checking plumbing and electrical systems, servicing playground equipment, maintaining trails, and documenting any repairs that would be needed before the park reopened for public use. Most of the maintenance work was done during daylight hours, but some tasks required overnight stays at the park to complete multi-day projects. I had keys to all facilities and permission to use park housing when extended work schedules made commuting impractical. The maintenance project I'm describing involved upgrading campground electrical systems and installing new picnic tables throughout the park. The work required several days of electrical installation, concrete pouring, and equipment assembly that was easier to complete without interference from park visitors. I'd established a routine of staying in one of the park's maintenance cabins and working systematic routes through different sections of the facility. The park was beautiful during late February, snow-covered trails, frozen lake, and wildlife that was comfortable with minimal human presence. For the first 3 days, the maintenance work proceeded exactly as planned. I updated electrical service to camping sites, installed new picnic tables, and completed repairs to playground equipment that had been damaged during winter weather. But during my 4th day, I started noticing that my work was under systematic observation by something that demonstrated unusual interest in park maintenance activities. Equipment left outside overnight showed signs of examination, handprints on surfaces, disturbed materials, and evidence that someone had been testing the function and installation of playground and picnic equipment. The examination pattern showed intelligence and technical curiosity that exceeded anything I'd encountered in 9 years of park maintenance work. The investigator had focused specifically on newly installed equipment and seemed to understand the relationship between different recreational facilities. Most disturbing were the handprints I found on newly installed picnic tables and playground equipment. They were much larger than human normal, with fingers that were too long and showed clear evidence of claws, but they also demonstrated opposable thumbs and careful manipulation of park facilities. The size and depth of the prints suggested something over 7 feet tall, with handspan that exceeded typical human proportions. But the careful examination pattern indicated understanding of recreational equipment and apparent evaluation of installation quality. That evening, while I was updating maintenance records in the park office, I heard sounds outside that didn't match normal winter wildlife activity. Heavy footsteps moving around park buildings, but with deliberate stealth that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random animal movement. I looked out the office windows but could see only darkness beyond the security lighting around park buildings. The footsteps continued for over an hour, sometimes approaching close enough that I could sense presence just beyond the lighted areas. Around 10 p.m., I heard what sounded like someone testing playground equipment. The distinctive sounds of swings moving, seesaws being operated, and slides being used. But when I checked outside with a flashlight, the playground was empty. The sounds continued throughout the night, suggesting systematic evaluation of park recreational facilities by something that understood their intended function and was apparently conducting its own quality assessment of the equipment I'd been installing. Around 2 a.m., I heard vocalizations that convinced me I was dealing with something outside normal park maintenance experience. Sounds that were part growl, part howl, but with inflections that seemed almost like speech. Low, rumbling vocalizations that had rhythm and pattern. The sounds seemed to come from different locations around the park, suggesting either multiple individuals or one creature moving with remarkable speed between facility areas. The next morning, I found evidence that confirmed my night observations. Large footprints around newly installed equipment showing systematic examination of park facilities. But the tracks also showed something remarkable. Apparent understanding of proper equipment use and recreational safety. The creature had used playground equipment correctly, operated picnic table features appropriately, and seemed to understand the intended function of each facility I'd installed. The level of comprehension suggested intelligence that exceeded typical animal curiosity about human installations. But I also found evidence of what appeared to be improvements to my work. Adjustments to equipment positioning that enhanced safety and functionality. Modifications to picnic table arrangements that improve site utilization. And changes to playground layouts that demonstrated understanding of recreational flow patterns. The improvements showed engineering knowledge that exceeded my own experience with park facility design and suggested someone with professional understanding of recreational planning principles. During my 5th day of maintenance work, I had direct encounters that confirmed what had been studying my park improvement activities. While I was installing the final picnic table at a remote camping site, I became aware that I was being observed from the forest edge. Looking up from my work, I could see a tall figure standing among the trees, apparently studying my installation procedures. The figure was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, with a muscular torso covered in dark brown fur. But the head was unmistakably canine, with pointed ears and what appeared to be a prominent muzzle. What struck me most were the eyes. They glowed with their own amber light and tracked my work with obvious interest in installation techniques and quality standards. There was recognition there, understanding that I was performing facility maintenance, and something that looked like professional evaluation of my work methods. We observed each other for several minutes. The creature showed no aggression or territorial behavior, but there was an intensity in its attention that suggested I was being assessed for competence and possibly for compatibility with its own understanding of how park facilities should be designed and maintained. Then it did something that challenged my assumptions about wildlife behavior. It approached the picnic table installation site and began examining my work with obvious understanding of construction techniques and quality standards. Using hands that were clearly not paws, it tested the stability of the table. evaluated the level installation, and seemed to assess whether my work met appropriate standards for recreational equipment. The level of technical comprehension it demonstrated was remarkable. It understood proper installation procedures, recognized quality workmanship, and appeared to approve of the improvements I was making to park facilities. When I spoke to identify myself as a park maintenance worker, the creature looked at me with what appeared to be acknowledgement and perhaps approval of my role in maintaining recreational facilities. It remained at the installation site for nearly 30 minutes, conducting what could only be described as its own quality inspection of my work. Then it made a sound that might have been approval, a low rumbling that had positive inflection, before moving away into the forest. I completed my maintenance project and filed my final report with careful attention to documenting the successful installation of new equipment and the completion of all scheduled repairs. I mentioned wildlife activity, but avoided specific details about the technical knowledge and apparent quality assessment I'd observed. The state park continues to operate successfully, with visitor reviews consistently praising the quality of recreational facilities and the thoughtful design of camping and day-use areas. Park staff have noted that equipment maintenance needs are lower than expected, possibly due to high installation quality or exceptional care by park users. When other maintenance workers ask about assignments to remote state parks, I recommend focusing on quality workmanship and understanding that your work might be under evaluation by entities with their own standards for recreational facility design and environmental compatibility. Story 13. The Surveyor. Land surveying in Michigan's remote forest areas requires working alone with precision instruments to establish property boundaries, topographic features, and legal descriptions for areas that might not have been surveyed for decades. During my 14 years as a licensed surveyor, I'd worked throughout the Great Lakes region and thought I understood what kinds of challenges I might encounter in backcountry survey work. But during a property boundary survey in Mason County 2 years ago, when I was 39, I discovered that some areas of Michigan's wilderness have inhabitants who take a very personal interest in human activities that involve measuring and mapping their territory. The survey I'm describing was for a 640-acre tract of forested land that was being considered for timber harvesting and recreational development. The property had been in the same family for over 50 years, but recent inheritance issues required updated legal descriptions and precise boundary identification. My job was to locate original survey monuments, establish new boundary markers, and create detailed maps showing topographic features, vegetation types, and access routes that would be needed for future land management decisions. The work required hiking through dense forest with surveying equipment, establishing sight lines between survey points, and spending extended time in remote locations to complete measurements and documentation. I'd surveyed similar forested properties throughout Michigan and was experienced with the challenges of backcountry survey work, difficult terrain, limited access, and the need to work alone for days at a time in areas where help might be hours away. The property was located about 15 miles northeast of Ludington, accessible by forest roads that required four-wheel drive vehicles to navigate. The terrain was typical West Michigan forest, rolling hills covered with oak, maple, and pine, intersected by creeks and wetland areas that provided natural landmarks for survey work. For the first week, the survey proceeded exactly as planned. I located several original survey monuments, established new reference points, and began the detailed mapping work that would be needed for legal documentation. The property boundaries followed natural features in some areas, creek beds, ridge lines, and wetland edges, but also included straight-line sections that required precise measurement and marking through dense forest. But during my second week on the survey, I started noticing that my work was under systematic observation by something that demonstrated unusual interest in land surveying activities. Equipment left at survey stations overnight showed signs of examination. Tripod legs adjusted, instrument cases opened, and survey markers moved to different positions. The examination pattern showed intelligence and technical curiosity that exceeded anything I'd encountered in 14 years of surveying work. The investigator had focused specifically on surveying instruments and seemed to understand their function in measuring and mapping terrain. Most disturbing were the changes I found to my survey work. Stakes that had been relocated to more stable positions, sight lines that had been cleared of obstructing vegetation, and survey markers that had been improved with additional flagging and protection. The modifications showed understanding of surveying principles and apparent knowledge of how to enhance measurement accuracy and marker visibility. But they also represented unauthorized changes to legally significant work that could affect property boundaries and land ownership. During my third week, I found evidence that convinced me my surveying activities were being systematically studied by something with its own understanding of territory measurement and boundary establishment. I discovered what appeared to be an independent survey system. Markers made from natural materials, sight lines cleared through forest, and reference points established using techniques that demonstrated clear understanding of surveying principles. The markers were positioned with precision that exceeded my own survey work and showed understanding of topographic relationships that suggested advanced knowledge of land measurement techniques. But the markers were made from stone cairns, wooden posts, and blazed trees that used traditional surveying methods that predated modern electronic instruments. The craftsmanship showed expertise that exceeded anything I'd seen in historical survey records. Most remarkable was the accuracy of the alternative survey system. When I checked the natural markers against my own electronic measurements, I found that they were positioned with precision that matched modern GPS technology. That evening, while I was updating survey notes at my temporary camp near the property centre, I had my first direct encounter with whatever had been studying my surveying work. Around sunset, while I was reviewing the day's measurements, I became aware that I was being observed from the forest edge. Looking up from my field notes, I could see a tall figure standing among the trees, apparently studying my surveying equipment and documentation procedures. The figure was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, with a muscular build covered in dark brown fur. But the head was unmistakably canine, with pointed ears and what appeared to be a prominent muzzle. What struck me most were the eyes. They glowed with their own amber light and tracked my work with obvious interest in surveying techniques and mapping procedures. There was recognition there, understanding that I was conducting territorial measurement and something that looked like professional evaluation of my methods. We observed each other for several minutes. The creature showed no aggression or territorial defensiveness, but there was an intensity in its attention that suggested I was being assessed for accuracy and possibly for compatibility with its own understanding of how territory should be measured and documented. Then it did something that challenged my assumptions about wildlife territorial behavior. It approached my survey station and began examining my equipment, with obvious understanding of surveying instruments and their function in land measurement. Using hands that were clearly not paws, it tested the stability of my tripod setup, evaluated the positioning of my electronic instruments, and seemed to assess whether my surveying methods met appropriate standards for territorial documentation. The level of technical comprehension it demonstrated was remarkable. It understood proper surveying procedures, recognized quality equipment, and appeared to evaluate the accuracy of my measurement techniques. When I spoke to identify myself as a licensed surveyor conducting legal boundary work, the creature looked at me with what appeared to be acknowledgement and perhaps curiosity about human methods of territorial measurement. It spent nearly an hour examining my surveying equipment and reviewing my field notes, apparently comparing my electronic methods with its own traditional surveying techniques. Then it led me to several locations where it had established survey markers using natural materials. The precision and accuracy of its work was extraordinary, showing understanding of surveying principles that exceeded many professional surveyors I'd worked with. The creature's survey system integrated with natural topographic features in ways that enhanced both accuracy and environmental compatibility. Its methods represented a sophisticated understanding of land measurement that used traditional techniques with modern precision. When I completed my survey and prepared my final maps, I included the creature's natural markers as additional reference points, recognizing their accuracy and potential value for future land management decisions. I filed my survey report with careful attention to documenting the legal boundaries and topographic features required by my clients. I mentioned finding historical survey markers, but avoided specific details about the advanced surveying techniques and apparent territorial knowledge I'd encountered. The property continues to be managed using my survey documentation, but land management decisions have consistently incorporated environmental considerations and natural features in ways that reflect understanding beyond typical forestry practices. When other surveyors ask about working in areas where local people report unusual wildlife activity, I recommend maintaining professional standards while remaining open to traditional knowledge and natural indicators that might enhance surveying accuracy and environmental compatibility. Some survey work involves more than just establishing legal boundaries. It requires understanding that you might be working in territories where other entities have been measuring and documenting land features with precision and expertise that predates modern surveying technology. Story 14. The Firewatch. This happened 2 years ago when I was 26, working Firewatch for the Forest Service out of the Manistee National Forest station. I'd taken the job partly for the solitude and partly because the pay wasn't bad for basically sitting in a tower all day, scanning for smoke. The tower was about 40 feet up, steel construction from the 1960s, positioned on a ridge that gave me a clear view over maybe 20 square miles of dense Michigan forest. It was late September, perfect weather, crisp mornings, warm afternoons, and those long autumn twilights that make you understand why people love the North Woods. My shift ran from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., but I'd usually get up there by 5:30 to catch the sunrise and make my first radio check with dispatch. The tower had basic amenities: a desk, radio equipment, binoculars, and a logbook, where I recorded weather conditions and any suspicious activity. On clear days like this one, I could see all the way to the Manistee River Valley, a dark green line cutting through the canopy about 8 miles southeast. I'd been on the job for 3 weeks and was settling into the routine. Most days were quiet. Maybe a few hikers on the distant trails, occasionally a Forest Service truck on one of the logging roads. The wildlife was active this time of year. I'd logged deer movements, watched turkey flocks moving through clearings, and once spotted a black bear working over some berry bushes about half a mile out. Standard stuff that went in my daily reports. The first weird thing happened on a Tuesday morning around 8 a.m. I was scanning the southern sector when I noticed something that made me pause. The forest had gone completely silent. Not just quiet, silent in a way that felt wrong. No birds, no squirrel chatter, nothing. I'd been in these woods long enough to know that total silence usually means a predator is around, probably a bear or maybe coyotes. But this quiet stretched on for maybe 20 minutes, covering what looked like a huge area. Through my binoculars, I could see deer at the edge of a clearing about 2 miles out, and they were all facing the same direction, ears up, alert as hell. Whatever was out there had spooked everything for miles. Around 10 a.m., the normal forest sounds gradually returned, but those deer didn't relax for another hour. I made a note in the logbook about possible larger predator activity in Sector 7, figuring the DNR might want to check it out. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to how organized it all seemed, like something was deliberately moving through a specific area, clearing out everything in its path. The second incident happened 3 days later, just after sunset. I was packing up my gear when I heard something that stopped me cold. It sounded like a woman screaming, but not quite right. The pitch was off, too sustained, and it was coming from maybe half a mile north of the tower. My first thought was that someone was in serious trouble. Maybe a hiker had fallen or gotten attacked by a bear. I grabbed my radio and called it in to dispatch, but they said no one had permits for that area and no missing person reports. I stayed in the tower another hour, listening. The sound came again twice, from slightly different locations each time, like whatever was making it was moving around. But here's the thing that really bothered me. It wasn't moving randomly. The sounds formed a rough triangle around my position, like something was circling the tower at a distance. When I mentioned this to my supervisor the next morning, he just shrugged and said probably coyotes. But I'd heard coyotes plenty of times, and this wasn't that. The third incident is when I knew for sure something was wrong. It was the following Monday, overcast and quiet. Around 2 p.m., I caught movement through my binoculars in a clearing about a mile northeast. At first, I thought it was a bear, dark and moving through the trees at the clearing's edge. But bears don't move like that. This thing was too fluid, too purposeful. I watched it for maybe 5 minutes as it worked its way around the perimeter of the clearing, staying in the shadows but occasionally stepping into the light. When it did step out, I got a clear look, and my hand started shaking. It was walking on 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, maybe 7 feet, with a torso that seemed too muscular and arms that hung too long. The head was definitely canine. I could see the elongated snout even at that distance. But the way it moved, stopping to look directly at my tower like it knew I was watching, that was the most disturbing part. It stood there for probably 30 seconds, and I swear I could feel those eyes on me even from a mile away. Then it dropped to all fours and disappeared into the forest so fast, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. I called my supervisor again, but when I started describing what I'd seen, he cut me off and said to stick to logging smoke and weather conditions. The message was clear: keep the weird stuff to yourself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. The next 2 days, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. always just at the edge of visibility. Nothing definite, but enough to keep me on edge. And that unnatural silence kept happening, moving through different sectors like a wave. Thursday evening, I was getting ready to climb down when I heard footsteps on the metal stairs below me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that rang against the steel. My first thought was that someone from the Forest Service had come to check on me, but there was no vehicle in the clearing, and no one had radioed up. I called out, "Hello, someone down there?" The footsteps stopped. I waited maybe 30 seconds, then called again. Nothing. I leaned over the platform railing to look down, and that's when I saw it. About 15 feet up the tower, something was looking back at me. Amber eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light, set in a face that was definitely not human. The snout was longer than any dog's, filled with teeth that were visible even though its mouth was barely open. But the eyes, those eyes held intelligence. Not animal intelligence, but something that understood exactly what I was and what I was thinking. Time seemed to stop. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. The thing was gripping the tower supports with hands that were way too large, claws that scraped against the metal with every small movement. Its shoulders were massive, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the light. And it was studying me with those amber eyes, like it was deciding something important. The wrongness of it hit me like a physical blow. This thing shouldn't exist, shouldn't be able to climb steel towers, shouldn't be looking at me with that kind of focused intelligence. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I was 40 feet up with nowhere to go. Then it started climbing again. Those massive hands found purchase on the supports, and it moved up toward me with smooth, purposeful movements. I could hear my own voice saying no, 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 over and over but I still couldn't move. When it reached the platform level, maybe 10 feet from me horizontally, it stopped and rose to its full height. 7 feet tall, easy. The transformation from its climbing position to standing upright was the most disturbing thing I've ever witnessed. Its limbs reconfigured in ways that looked fundamentally wrong, like its joints bent in directions that shouldn't be possible. And through it all, those amber eyes never left mine. I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly I was climbing over the far side of the platform, scrambling down the tower supports with no regard for safety. I dropped the last 8 feet and hit the ground running. My truck was parked maybe 50 yards away, and I made it there in what felt like seconds. I didn't look back until I was 5 miles down the forest road, and even then I kept the speedometer at 70 until I reached the highway. I called in sick the next day and submitted my resignation the day after that. Told them I'd found other work, which was true. I got a job with a surveying company that worked exclusively in suburban areas. I've never been back to that tower, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, when I'm driving through forested areas at night, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror for amber eyes, and I know that thing is still out there, watching the next poor bastard who thinks the North Woods are empty. Story 15. The Survey Team. This happened last summer when I was 28, working as a junior surveyor for Northland Engineering out of Traverse City. We'd gotten a contract to map property boundaries for a timber sale in some remote forest land about 15 miles southwest of Cadillac, right in the heart of what used to be prime logging country back in the 1800s. The area was a mix of second-growth hardwoods and pine plantations, crisscrossed with old logging roads that barely showed up on modern maps. Our team consisted of 4 people: myself, our crew chief Dave, who had 20 years in surveying, Lisa, our GPS specialist, and Tom, who ran the total station equipment. We were planning a 5-day project, camping on site to minimize travel time. The client wanted exact boundaries marked for about 800 acres, which meant cutting sight lines through thick forest and establishing permanent markers every few hundred yards. The property had an interesting history. Dave had done some research and found out it was originally logged by the Manistee and Northeastern Railroad around 1890, then abandoned when the big timber ran out. The old railroad grade was still visible in places, just a depression in the forest floor, with occasional rusted spikes poking through the leaf litter. There were also remnants of a lumber camp somewhere in the northwest section, foundation stones, and maybe some equipment too heavy to move when they pulled out. We set up our base camp near the center of the property, in a natural clearing beside a creek that showed up on the 1920s survey maps as Bear Creek. It was perfect for our needs. Level ground, fresh water, and access to the old logging road we'd used to get our equipment in. The first day went smoothly. We established our primary control points and started working the perimeter, cutting sight lines and marking corners with steel rods and flagging tape. The wildlife was active, which we expected for late July. Plenty of deer sign, some bear scat that looked fairly fresh, and enough bird activity to keep the morning interesting. Tom mentioned seeing a really large dog track near the creek, but we figured it was probably a coyote. They can get pretty big in this area, especially the males. Day 2 is when we first noticed something odd. We were working the eastern boundary, maybe half a mile from camp, when Lisa pointed out that her GPS unit was acting up. Instead of the usual 3 to 5 foot accuracy, it was jumping around by 30 or 40 feet, sometimes losing satellite lock entirely. We've all dealt with canopy interference before, but this was different. The signal problems seemed to move with us, like something was actively jamming the satellites. Dave suggested we switch to traditional transit and chain methods for this section, which slowed us down, but gave us accurate measurements. The weird part was that when we moved to a different area, Lisa's GPS worked fine. It was only along that particular stretch of boundary that the electronics went haywire. Tom joked that maybe the old lumber camp had some kind of magnetic anomaly, but his metal detector was reading normal. That evening around the campfire, we were comparing notes when Lisa mentioned feeling like she was being watched all afternoon. Tom said he'd had the same feeling, especially when working near the tree line. Dave, being the practical one, pointed out that we were probably just picking up on normal wildlife activity. Bears will sometimes follow humans around out of curiosity, and we were definitely in bear country. But I'd felt it too, that prickly sensation between your shoulder blades that comes from being observed. And it wasn't random. Whatever was watching us seemed to coordinate its attention, focusing on whoever was working alone or slightly separated from the group. When we stayed close together, the feeling went away. Day 3 brought the first really disturbing incident. We were working the northern section, near where the old lumber camp was supposed to be, when Tom called us over to look at something. He'd been cutting a sight line through a thick stand of birch when he found tree damage that didn't make sense. 3 birch trees, each about 8 inches in diameter, had deep parallel scratches running from about 4 feet off the ground up to nearly 7 feet. The marks looked fresh, white wood showing through the bark, sap still wet in places. Dave examined them with a magnifying glass and said they were definitely claw marks, but from an animal way larger than anything that should be in these woods. A black bear might reach 6 feet standing on his hind legs, but these marks went higher than that, and the spacing between individual claws suggested something with much larger paws than even the biggest bear. We took photos for the client's environmental impact report, but privately we were all getting nervous. The scratches followed a deliberate pattern, moving through the forest in a rough line that paralleled our survey route from the day before. It was like something had been following our progress and marking territory as it went. We found similar damage on 5 more trees over the next 2 hours, always at the same height range, always with that distinctive claw spacing. Around 2 p.m., while Lisa and I were running a traverse line near the creek, we heard something that made us both freeze. A howl, but not like anything I'd ever heard before. It started low and mournful like a wolf, then shifted into something that sounded almost human, like someone crying in pain or terror. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions, echoing off the trees in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Lisa grabbed my arm and whispered, "That's not a coyote." She was right. Coyotes yip and bark, sometimes howl, but this was something else entirely. The howl repeated twice more over the next few minutes, each time from a different location, but maintaining that disturbing human quality. We packed up our equipment and headed back to the main group without finishing that traverse line. When we rejoined Dave and Tom, they'd heard it too and were looking pretty shaken. Dave tried to maintain his professional composure, but I could see he was rattled. Tom suggested we might want to finish the job from base camp, working shorter distances and staying in radio contact at all times. Nobody argued with that plan. That night, none of us slept well. The forest around our camp had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press in from all directions. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something large moving around the perimeter of our camp. Footsteps, but not quite right. Sometimes they sounded bipedal, sometimes like a large animal moving on all fours. I lay in my tent listening as whatever it was circled us slowly, deliberately, stopping occasionally right outside the tent walls. At one point, I heard breathing that sounded way too close, like something was standing right next to my head, with only the tent fabric between us. I wanted to wake the others, but I was afraid that any sound might provoke whatever was out there. Day 4 is when everything went to hell. We decided to work in pairs, staying within shouting distance of each other, and checking in every 30 minutes by radio. Dave and Tom took the western section, while Lisa and I finished the northern boundaries. We were maybe a quarter mile apart, close enough for radio contact but not for visual. Around 10 a.m., I was setting up the total station, while Lisa worked about 50 yards away, marking a corner with flagging tape. I heard her call my name, but when I looked up, she wasn't where I'd left her. Her voice seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, maybe 100 yards north of her last position. "Steve, can you help me with this marker?" It sounded exactly like Lisa, but something felt wrong about it. Why would she have moved so far from our work area? And her voice had an odd quality, like someone doing a very good imitation, but not quite getting the inflection right. I called back, "Lisa, where are you? I can't see you." No response. I tried the radio, but got only static. Then I heard her voice again, even farther away. "Steve, I need help. Can you come here?" This time, I was sure it wasn't really Lisa. The words were right, but the tone was all wrong, too flat, like someone reading from a script. I packed up the total station as fast as I could and started moving toward where I'd last seen her. I found her about 60 yards away, standing at the base of a massive oak tree with her back to me. She wasn't moving, just standing there perfectly still in a way that made my skin crawl. "Lisa," I called out. She didn't respond or turn around. As I got closer, I could see that her shoulders were shaking slightly, like she was crying, or maybe laughing very quietly. "Lisa, are you okay?" When she finally turned around, her face was completely white, eyes wide with terror. "Steve," she whispered. "It was calling your name, using my voice to call your name." Her hands were shaking as she pointed deeper into the woods. "It's still out there, and it sounds exactly like me." We heard it then, my own voice coming from the darkness between the trees. "Lisa, where are you? I can't see you." Perfect reproduction of exactly what I'd said 5 minutes earlier. Then Lisa's voice answering. "Steve, I need help. Can you come here?" A conversation between our own voices, playing back from something hidden in the forest. That's when I saw the eyes. About 30 yards away, just at the edge of visibility between the trees, 2 amber points of light watching us. Not reflecting light like an animal's eyes would, actually glowing with their own illumination. And there was intelligence behind them, malevolent and focused entirely on us. I grabbed Lisa's hand and started backing away, never taking my eyes off those amber lights. They followed our movement, staying parallel as we retreated toward the logging road. I could hear something large moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with us, but staying just out of sight. We made it to the road and ran the 1/4 mile back to base camp, where we found Dave and Tom packing up their equipment, with faces white as sheets. They'd heard the voice mimicry too. Tom's voice calling for Dave from 3 different locations simultaneously, having a conversation with itself while the real Tom was standing right there. We broke camp in record time and got out of there without finishing the survey. Dave reported equipment problems to the client and said we'd need to return with different instruments. But none of us had any intention of going back. We'd seen enough to know that whatever was in those woods was something that understood us, could copy our voices perfectly, and was intelligent enough to use psychological warfare. I quit surveying 2 months later and got into construction work that keeps me in populated areas. But sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear my own voice calling to me from outside the house, and I know that thing is still out there in the woods, practicing human conversations with stolen voices. Story 16. The Security Guard. This happened 3 years ago when I was 24, working overnight security for a lumber processing plant about 10 miles east of Cross Village, Michigan. The facility had been shut down for 6 months while the owners tried to work out some kind of financing deal, but they still needed someone to keep an eye on the equipment and make sure nobody broke in to steal copper or vandalize the machinery. It wasn't a bad gig, 12 hours a night, 4 nights a week, mostly just walking around with a flashlight and checking doors. The plant sat on about 40 acres, surrounded on 3 sides by dense mixed forest that stretched for miles toward Lake Michigan. The 4th side faced the county road, where I'd parked my car next to the main gate. The buildings were typical industrial construction. A main processing hall with a metal roof, several storage sheds, and a small office building where I'd set up my base of operations. Most of the heavy equipment was still in place. Bandsaws, planers, conveyor systems, all covered with tarps and slowly gathering dust. My routine was pretty straightforward. I'd arrive at 6 p.m., do a complete walk around of the perimeter, check all the building locks, then settle into the office to do paperwork and monitor the basic alarm system. Every 2 hours, I'd make another security round, logging everything in a notebook that I'd turn into my supervisor each week. The pay was decent, and most nights were quiet enough that I could catch up on reading or study for some certification courses I was taking. The first month went by without any problems. Occasionally I'd see deer at the forest edge, and once a black bear wandered across the back lot around 2 a.m., but nothing unusual for rural Michigan. The local sheriff's deputy would swing by maybe twice a week, just to make sure my car was there and everything looked normal. I actually enjoyed the solitude and the chance to be outdoors without dealing with crowds or traffic. The first weird incident happened on a Tuesday night in early October. I was doing my 10 p.m. security round when I noticed that the motion-activated floodlight on the north side of the main building had come on. These lights were triggered by anything larger than a house cat moving within about 30 feet, and they'd stay on for 5 minutes before shutting off automatically. When I got around to that side of the building, the light was already cycling off, but I could see what looked like fresh footprints in the muddy area near the loading dock. The prints were bigger than anything I'd expected, maybe 6 inches wide and 8 inches long, with what looked like claw marks at the front of each toe. They were definitely not human, but they didn't look quite right for bear either. Bear prints are more rounded, and these were longer and narrower, almost like a very large dog. The strange thing was that they approached the building from the forest, circled around the loading dock area twice, then headed straight back into the woods. I took some photos with my phone and made a note in the logbook, figuring maybe a large dog had gotten loose from one of the farms down the road. But over the next hour, that floodlight triggered 3 more times, always with the same pattern. Something approaching from the forest, moving around the building, then leaving. I started timing my security rounds to coincide with the light activations, but I never actually saw what was triggering them. The second incident happened about a week later, around midnight on a Friday. I was sitting in the office doing some reading when I heard what sounded like metal creaking somewhere in the main building. The sound was rhythmic, like someone was climbing on the equipment or maybe trying to force open one of the roll-up doors. I grabbed my flashlight and keys and went to investigate. The main building was dark except for the emergency exit signs, but I knew the layout pretty well by then. I could hear the creaking sound coming from the far end, near where the band saws were located. As I walked deeper into the building, my flashlight beam picked up something that made me stop cold. One of the tarps covering a large planer had been pulled aside, and there were scratches in the metal housing that definitely hadn't been there during my last inspection. The scratches were deep, like someone had dragged steel claws across the painted surface with considerable force. They formed parallel lines about 2 inches apart, running from near the base of the machine up to about 7 feet off the ground. But here's what really bothered me. The tarp hadn't just been moved. It had been folded neatly and placed to one side, like someone with hands had carefully uncovered the machine before scratching it up. I checked the rest of the building and found similar damage on 3 other pieces of equipment, always with that same neat folding of the protective tarps. Nothing had been stolen or seriously damaged, but something had definitely been in there, examining the machinery with what seemed like intelligent curiosity. I called my supervisor the next morning, but he just told me to keep an eye on things and maybe check the perimeter fencing for holes where large animals might get through. Over the next 2 weeks, the nocturnal visits became a regular thing. Almost every night, the motion lights would trigger multiple times, and I'd find new evidence of something exploring the facility. Scratches on building walls, muddy prints on concrete, and occasionally equipment tarps that had been disturbed. But whatever was doing this was incredibly elusive. I never caught more than glimpses of movement at the edge of my flashlight beam. The psychological pressure started getting to me. I'd find myself constantly checking over my shoulder, especially when walking between buildings. The forest that had seemed peaceful and normal during my first month on the job now felt threatening, like it was full of eyes watching my every move. I started carrying a baseball bat along with my flashlight, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against something large enough to leave those claw marks. The direct encounter happened on a Sunday night in late October. I was making my 2 a.m. security round when I heard a sound that froze me in place, a low howl that seemed to come from right behind the main building. But it wasn't a normal animal howl. It had this human quality, like someone trying to imitate a wolf, but not quite getting it right. The sound was too controlled, too purposeful. I turned off my flashlight and waited, listening. The howl came again, this time from a different direction, maybe 50 yards closer to my position. Then a third time from yet another location. Whatever was making that sound was moving around the facility, and it seemed to be coordinating multiple positions. That's when I realized there might be more than one of them. I started walking quickly back toward the office building, but I hadn't gone 10 yards when the motion lights on 3 different buildings all came on at once. In the overlapping pools of bright light, I could see movement, dark shapes that seemed too large and moved too fluidly to be normal animals. One of them was near the storage shed, maybe 60 feet away, and in the brief moment before it disappeared into the shadows, I saw it rise up on its hind legs to nearly human height. That's when the silence hit. Complete, unnatural silence that seemed to muffle even the sound of my own footsteps. The normal night sounds, insects, distant traffic, wind through the trees, all disappeared like someone had thrown a switch. And in that silence, I could hear breathing that definitely wasn't my own, coming from multiple directions around me. I made it to the office building and locked the door behind me, then killed the interior lights so I could see outside without being silhouetted in the windows. What I saw in the security lights made my hands shake so badly I could barely hold my phone to call for backup. There were 3 of them, moving through the facility with coordinated precision that showed clear intelligence and planning. The largest one was maybe 7 feet tall when it stood upright, with massive shoulders and a head that was definitely canine, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite process. Its fur was dark, almost black, and its eyes glowed amber in the artificial light. The other 2 were slightly smaller, but just as wrong, moving sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes on 2, with a fluid transition between postures that made my brain hurt to watch. They weren't randomly exploring anymore. They were searching the buildings systematically, checking doors and windows with what looked like tactical precision. And periodically, they'd stop and look directly at the office building where I was hiding, those amber eyes seeming to focus right on my position despite the dark windows. I called 911, but when I tried to explain what I was seeing, the dispatcher kept asking if I was sure it wasn't just bears or large dogs. I couldn't make her understand that these things were working together with human-like intelligence, that they were testing the facility's security in ways that suggested they understood exactly what they were dealing with. The creatures spent about 20 minutes systematically examining every building, then simply melted back into the forest. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, leaving only those distinctive claw scratches on several more pieces of equipment, and a sense that they'd accomplished whatever they'd come to do. When the sheriff's deputy arrived 40 minutes later, all he found were the tracks and scratches. He took a report but clearly thought I'd let my imagination run away with me. His theory was that a pack of unusually large coyotes had wandered through the area, maybe attracted by scents from the lumber processing. I turned in my resignation the next morning, told my supervisor that the isolation was getting to me and I'd found a day job in town. That was partially true. I had found another job, working security for a shopping mall where the biggest threat was teenagers shoplifting candy. But the real reason was that I knew those things would be back, and next time they might decide to test more than just the buildings. I still drive past that plant sometimes, just to see if there are new claw marks on the walls or fresh prints in the parking lot. There always are. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is blowing from the north, I swear I can hear that almost human howling drifting down from the forest, calling to something that understands the sound and calls back. Story 17. The Documentary Crew. This happened last October, when I was 29, working as a sound engineer for an independent documentary crew, filming a piece about abandoned lumber camps in northern Wisconsin. The project was called Ghost Towns of the Northwoods, and we were focusing on places that had thrived during the logging boom of the 1880s and 1890s, then vanished when the timber ran out. Our particular location was the remnants of a camp called Bray Station, about 8 miles northwest of Elkhorn in some of the most remote forest land you'll find in southern Wisconsin. Our crew consisted of 5 people: Marcus, the director and producer; Sarah, our cinematographer; Jake, who handled second camera and drone footage; myself, running sound and backup camera; and Linda, who was both our researcher and our connection to the Wisconsin Historical Society. We'd planned a 4-day shoot, camping on site to capture the area's atmosphere and maybe document some of the paranormal activity that locals claimed happened around the old camp foundations. Bray Station had been a substantial operation in its day, housing for about 200 lumberjacks, a company store, blacksmith shop, and the usual collection of saloons and boarding houses that sprang up around logging camps. By 1895, the surrounding forest had been clear-cut, and the whole settlement was abandoned within 2 years. What remained was a collection of stone foundations, some collapsed building frames, and a cemetery with maybe 30 graves, most marked only with numbered wooden stakes. Linda had done extensive research and found some interesting historical details. The camp had a reputation for violence even by logging camp standards, with at least 6 documented murders and several mysterious disappearances during its operational years. There were also Native American oral histories suggesting the area had been avoided by local tribes long before white settlers arrived, though the specific reasons had been lost to time. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon in perfect autumn weather, clear skies, temperatures in the mid-60s, and that brilliant fall foliage that makes Wisconsin look like a postcard. The access road was barely passable, just an old logging trail that had been maintained well enough for Forest Service vehicles, but wasn't meant for regular traffic. We had to park about half a mile from the actual site and carry our equipment in on foot. The camp ruins were scattered across maybe 10 acres in a natural clearing beside what used to be called Bray Creek. The foundations were impressive, massive stone blocks that suggested buildings much larger than typical frontier construction. Linda pointed out the remains of the company store, identifiable by its distinctive L-shaped foundation and the fragments of a large safe that had been too heavy to move when the camp closed. We set up our base camp about 100 yards from the main ruins, close enough for easy access but far enough away to minimize our impact on the historical site. The first day went smoothly. We got establishing shots of the foundations, documented the cemetery, and Marcus conducted on-camera interviews with Linda about the camp's history and the circumstances of its abandonment. The wildlife was active, which we expected for late October. Plenty of deer sign, some bear scat that looked relatively fresh, and enough small game movement to keep our sound equipment picking up constant background noise. Jake mentioned seeing some unusually large tracks near the creek, but we figured they were probably from a big dog that had wandered in from one of the farms several miles away. That first night, we noticed something that seemed odd but not necessarily alarming. The forest around our camp went completely silent around 9 p.m. No insects, no night birds, nothing. This kind of silence usually indicates a large predator moving through the area, so we secured our food supplies and made sure our campfire was well contained. But the quiet lasted for over 2 hours, which was unusual even for a bear or cougar. Sarah mentioned feeling like she was being watched while reviewing footage on her laptop, but that's pretty normal when you're camping in remote areas. Your senses get heightened, and every small sound or movement catches your attention. We'd all had plenty of experience filming in wilderness locations, so we weren't too concerned. Day 2 brought our first really unsettling experience. We were filming in the cemetery area, documenting the numbered grave markers and trying to correlate them with Linda's historical records, when our equipment started acting up. Both cameras began experiencing battery drain that didn't make sense. Fresh batteries going from full charge to dead in under an hour. My sound equipment was picking up interference that sounded almost like voices, but too distorted to make out actual words. Jake's drone refused to maintain stable GPS lock, drifting erratically even in calm air. When we tried to retrieve it after a particularly bad oscillation, we found it had crashed about 50 yards into the forest, with claw marks on the plastic housing that definitely hadn't been there before launch. The scratches were too deep and too precisely spaced to be from tree branches, and they showed clear evidence of deliberate force rather than accidental damage. Linda was documenting the graves with still photography when she called us over to look at something disturbing. 3 of the wooden markers had been pushed over during the night, not fallen naturally but deliberately toppled and arranged in a triangular pattern around what appeared to be a much older stone marker that hadn't been visible the day before. The stone was carved with symbols that didn't match any known Native American or European traditions Linda was familiar with. More unsettling was the discovery of fresh digging around several graves. Not deep excavation, but systematic probing, like something had been testing the soil depth around the burial sites. The digging showed evidence of large claws rather than human tools, and there were massive paw prints in the soft earth that measured nearly 8 inches long. Marcus wanted to get footage of the disturbed graves and the mysterious stone marker, but every time we set up cameras in that area, the equipment malfunctioned. Batteries died, lenses fogged over despite clear weather, and the sound equipment picked up that same distorted voice-like interference. We managed to get about 10 minutes of usable footage before giving up and moving to a different part of the site. That afternoon, while filming the remains of the company store, Jake spotted movement in the tree line about 100 yards away. Through his telephoto lens, he got a brief glimpse of something large and dark watching us from the shadows between the trees. He described it as dog-like, but too big and too upright, standing maybe 6 or 7 feet tall on its hind legs. When he tried to get it in focus for a proper shot, it simply vanished into the forest. The second night was when we realized we were dealing with something far beyond normal wildlife activity. Around 11 p.m., we were sitting around our campfire reviewing the day's footage when we heard the most disturbing sound I've ever experienced. It started as a low howl, almost like a wolf, but gradually shifted into something that sounded unnervingly human, like someone crying or maybe screaming in anguish. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions, echoing off the trees in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. But what really got to us was the emotional quality. This wasn't just animal vocalization. There was intelligence behind it, and pain, and something that might have been trying to communicate. Sarah started crying without really understanding why, and even Marcus, who prided himself on maintaining professional objectivity, looked visibly shaken. Then we heard our names being called from the darkness beyond our campfire, one by one, in voices that sounded exactly like each other. Marcus calling for Sarah, Sarah calling for Jake, my own voice calling for Linda. Perfect reproductions of our speech patterns and inflections, but coming from something hidden in the forest that definitely wasn't human. Jake grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward where his voice was supposedly calling from, but Linda grabbed his arm and stopped him. "That's not Jake," she whispered, even though we could all hear Jake's voice continuing to call from the darkness. "Jake is right here." The voice mimicry continued for maybe 10 minutes, our own voices having conversations with themselves while we sat frozen around the fire. Day 3 was when we had our main encounter, and when I understood that we were dealing with something that possessed intelligence far beyond any normal animal. We were filming at the main foundation ruins, trying to get atmospheric shots for Marcus's narrative segments, when the forest around us went dead silent in that same unnatural way we'd experienced the previous nights. Sarah was operating the main camera while I monitored sound levels, when I noticed something in my headphones that made my skin crawl. Mixed in with the normal ambient audio, there were footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our position at maybe 50 yards out. But when I looked around, I couldn't see anything moving, and none of the others seemed aware of the sounds I was picking up. I signaled for everyone to stop and pulled off my headphones so the others could hear. The footsteps were clearly audible through the speakers, maintaining a steady rhythm as whatever was making them completed slow circuits around our filming location. Marcus started to speak, but I held up my hand for silence. The footsteps stopped the instant Marcus opened his mouth, then resumed when he closed it. That's when we realized whatever was out there was listening to us, responding to our actions with tactical awareness. It wasn't just some large animal that happened to be in the area. It was actively monitoring our behavior and adjusting its own actions accordingly. Linda whispered that we should pack up and leave immediately, but before we could move, we saw it. About 30 yards away, just at the edge of the tree line, something stepped into view that made every rational thought drain out of my head. It stood nearly 7 feet tall on 2 legs, with a torso that was massively muscled and covered in dark fur. The head was unmistakably canine, elongated snout, pointed ears, but the eyes were what really got to me. Amber-colored and clearly intelligent, they held a focused awareness that was studying us with obvious deliberation. The creature stood there for maybe 30 seconds, during which none of us moved or spoke. I could feel those amber eyes cataloguing every detail about us, our equipment, our positions, our obvious fear. Then it did something that convinced me we were dealing with intelligence, rather than just unusual animal behavior. It deliberately stepped behind a tree, moved to a different position, and emerged again, where we wouldn't expect it. This pattern continued for several minutes. The creature would show itself briefly, disappear, then reappear somewhere else, always maintaining visual contact, but staying just far enough away to avoid clear photography. It was playing with us, demonstrating its ability to control the encounter while studying our reactions. Sarah tried to get it in focus with her camera, but every time she raised the lens, the creature would step back into shadow. Finally, it rose to its full height, looked directly at each of us in turn with those intelligent amber eyes, then simply walked back into the forest with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes afterward, nobody speaking, before Marcus finally said we needed to pack up immediately. We broke camp in record time and were back to the vehicles within an hour. During the drive out, we compared notes about what we'd experienced, and everyone agreed on the key details: the creature's size, its obvious intelligence, and most disturbing of all, the sense that it had been studying us as deliberately as we'd been trying to document it. Marcus shelved the documentary project indefinitely. We had plenty of historical footage and interviews, but the creature encounters had changed the entire tone of what was supposed to be a straightforward historical piece. None of us felt comfortable returning to complete the filming, and Marcus wasn't sure how to incorporate what we'd experienced without sounding like we'd lost our minds. I left documentary work 6 months later and got into commercial video production, mostly shooting corporate training videos and wedding receptions. But I still have those audio recordings of the footsteps and the voice mimicry, and sometimes I play them back late at night, wondering what that thing in the forest was trying to tell us, and whether it's still out there, watching other filmmakers who think they're documenting empty ruins. Story 5. The Hunting Guide. This happened 3 winters ago when I was 31, working as a hunting guide for a small outfitter called Northwoods Adventures, based out of Rhinelander, Wisconsin. We specialized in white-tailed deer hunting, mostly guiding out-of-state hunters through some of the remote forest land in northern Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan. December is late in the season, but we often got clients who wanted to try for a trophy buck during the final weeks when the deer were focused on finding food rather than avoiding humans. I'd been guiding for about 5 years and knew the territory pretty well. Thousands of acres of mixed forest, old logging roads, and creek bottoms where the deer liked to travel. My particular specialty was scouting remote areas that other guides avoided, places where the deer were less pressured and more likely to produce the kind of trophy animals that clients were willing to pay premium rates to hunt. This particular trip involved 2 hunters from Illinois, Jim, a retired insurance executive who'd been hunting for 30 years, and his brother-in-law Rick, who was relatively new to the sport but had expensive equipment and high expectations. They'd booked a 3-day guided hunt in an area about 40 miles northeast of Minocqua, some of the most remote country in northern Wisconsin. The area we were hunting had an interesting history. It was part of a large tract that had been logged heavily in the 1890s, then abandoned when the timber played out. The Civilian Conservation Corps had done some reforestation work in the 1930s, but most of the land had been left to regenerate naturally. By the 2000s, it was mature second-growth forest with excellent deer habitat, thick cover, multiple water sources, and minimal hunting pressure due to access difficulties. We set up our base camp at an old CCC shelter about 2 miles from the nearest Forestry road. The shelter was just a 3-sided stone structure with a metal roof, but it provided wind protection and a place to process deer if we were successful. I'd been using this location for several years and had never had any problems beyond the occasional curious bear. The first day of hunting went normally. I had Jim and Rick positioned in tree stands about half a mile apart, both overlooking natural travel corridors where I'd seen fresh deer sign during my scouting trips. The weather was perfect for late-season hunting, cold but not brutal, with just enough snow to make tracking easy. I spent the day moving between their positions, checking on their comfort and watching for deer movement. We saw plenty of deer that first day, including a couple of decent bucks, but nothing that met Jim's standards for a trophy animal. Rick took a shot at a young buck around 3 p.m, but missed clean, which was probably for the best, since he hadn't been entirely sure of his target. We packed up at sunset and headed back to camp for dinner and planning the next day's hunt. That evening, around the fire, I noticed something that should have been more concerning than it seemed at the time. The normal night sounds of the forest, owls, distant coyote calls, the occasional branch falling, gradually faded to complete silence around 9 p.m. In my experience guiding, this usually means a large predator is moving through the area, typically a black bear or maybe a cougar, though cougars are pretty rare in Wisconsin. The silence lasted for over an hour, which was unusual, but I figured maybe a bear was working the area and would move on by morning. Jim and Rick were city guys who found the wilderness quite peaceful rather than ominous, so I didn't mention my concerns. Looking back, I should have been more alert to what that long silence might indicate. Day 2 brought the first signs that we were dealing with something beyond normal wildlife activity. I was checking the area around Jim's tree stand, looking for fresh deer sign, when I found tracks that stopped me cold. They were canine in shape but way too large, maybe 7 inches long and 5 inches wide, with claw marks that extended well beyond what you'd expect from even the largest dog. The tracks showed a strange gait pattern, sometimes appearing to be from a 4-legged animal, sometimes showing what looked like bipedal prints with a much longer stride length. They followed our route from the previous day, almost exactly, like something had been tracking our movements with deliberate precision. Most disturbing was that the tracks approached within 20 yards of Jim's tree stand, circled the area twice, then headed back into the thick forest. I took photos with my phone but decided not to mention the tracks to Jim and Rick until I could figure out what we were dealing with. My first thought was maybe a very large wolf, though wolves are extremely rare in this part of Wisconsin and typically avoid human activity. But the size and the bipedal prints didn't fit with any normal wolf behavior I was familiar with. During the morning hunt, I positioned myself where I could observe both hunters' locations while keeping an eye on the surrounding forest. Around 10 a.m., I noticed movement about 200 yards away that caught my attention. Something large and dark was paralleling our position, staying just at the edge of visibility between the trees. Through my binoculars, I could make out what looked like a very large dog, but it was moving with a fluid grace that seemed wrong for something that size. The thing that really bothered me was how it seemed to be observing our hunting setup with obvious intelligence. It would stop and watch for several minutes, then move to a different vantage point where it could continue monitoring our activities. This wasn't random animal behavior. It was systematic surveillance that suggested understanding of what we were doing and why we were positioned where we were. Around noon, Rick radioed that he'd seen something unusual near his position. When I reached his tree stand, he described a large animal that had approached within 30 yards, then stood on its hind legs to look directly at him. It was like it was trying to figure out what I was, he said, and it was way too big to be a dog, but it definitely wasn't a bear either. Rick was rattled enough that he wanted to come down from his stand, which was unusual for him. He was the kind of hunter who took pride in staying put regardless of weather or wildlife encounters. But he said something about the way the animal had looked at him made him feel like prey rather than predator, and he didn't want to be alone in the tree anymore. I convinced him to stay in position for the afternoon hunt, but I moved my own location to a spot where I could maintain visual contact with his stand. Good thing I did, because around 2 p.m., I saw something that made every hunting instinct I'd developed over 5 years of guiding scream that we were in serious trouble. The same large animal, or maybe another one just like it, emerged from the forest about 50 yards from Rick's position. But this time, instead of the quick glimpses I'd gotten earlier, I had a clear view through my binoculars of something that definitely wasn't a normal dog or wolf. It stood nearly 7 feet tall when upright, with a massively muscled torso covered in dark fur and a head that was unmistakably canine but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately process. The eyes were what really got to me. Even at 50 yards, they seemed to glow with their own amber light, and they held an intelligence that was studying Rick with the same focused attention that Rick was supposed to be using to hunt deer. This thing understood exactly what Rick was doing in that tree stand, and it was evaluating him with what looked like tactical assessment. I tried to radio Rick to warn him, but my equipment was suddenly filled with static that made communication impossible. Through the binoculars, I could see Rick becoming aware of the creature's presence, his body language shifting from relaxed alertness to rigid fear. The creature seemed to recognize this change and responded by rising to its full height, making itself unmistakably visible and obviously non-human. For maybe 3 minutes, Rick and this thing stared at each other in what looked like a standoff between predator and prey. Then the creature did something that convinced me we were dealing with intelligence rather than just unusual animal behavior. It deliberately knocked over a dead tree, creating a loud crash that would spook any deer in the area, then looked directly at Rick as if to communicate that the hunting was over for the day. I managed to reach Rick's position about 10 minutes after the creature disappeared back into the forest. He was climbing down from his stand with hands shaking so badly he could barely manage the safety harness. "We need to get out of here," he said. That thing was studying me like it was deciding whether I was worth the trouble of killing. When we got back to Jim's position, we found him packing up his equipment without being asked. He'd seen the same creature, or another one just like it, and had reached the same conclusion that Rick and I had. Whatever these things were, they were intelligent enough to understand our hunting operation and powerful enough to end it whenever they chose. We broke camp that afternoon and were back to the vehicles before sunset. During the drive out, all three of us compared notes about what we'd experienced, and the details were consistently disturbing. Multiple creatures, coordinated behavior, obvious intelligence, and sizes that were way beyond anything that should exist in Wisconsin forests. I reported the incident to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, but the wildlife biologist I spoke with suggested we'd probably encountered unusually large coyotes whose behavior had been modified by territorial stress. The official report listed it as atypical predator activity and recommended avoiding that particular area until after breeding season. I quit guiding 6 months later and got into equipment sales for outdoor retailers. Spending time in remote forests had lost its appeal once I understood that there were things out there capable of hunting the hunters. But I still check the DNR reports from that area, and there have been at least 4 similar incidents in the past 2 years. Guided hunts that ended early due to encounters with large, intelligent creatures that demonstrated coordinated behavior an obvious awareness of human hunting tactics. Jim and Rick never booked another hunt with our outfit, or anyone else as far as I know. But Jim called me about a year later to say he'd been researching what we might have encountered, and he'd found historical accounts going back to the 1800s of similar creatures in the same general area. Lumberjacks, trappers, and Native Americans all had stories about wolf-like beings that walked upright and possessed intelligence far beyond normal animals. The thing is, Jim said during that phone call, all the old stories agree on one point. These things don't just hunt for food. They hunt for the satisfaction of proving they're better predators than anything else in the forest. And now they know exactly who we are and where to find us. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to. Some hunting experiences teach you more about being prey than you ever wanted to know.